Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. I wasn't sure if I believed in curses before this happened. My name is Mia, and I was just an average high school senior before everything started spiraling out of control. It all began last summer when my family moved into an old, creaky house on the edge of town. The house was huge but run down, with peeling wallpaper and floors that groaned with every step. Mom called it full of character, but I just called it creepy. Still, it had a cheap rent, and my parents thought it was a steal. It wasn't long before I discovered the mirror in the attic. I'd gone up there to explore. The attic was dark and dusty, filled with boxes of stuff left behind by the previous owners. In the corner, leaning against the wall, was a tall, antique mirror. The frame was black and silver, carved with strange swirls and symbols. It was beautiful, but there was something off about it. When I stood in front of the mirror, I felt a chill. My reflection stared back, but it didn't feel like me. I brushed it off as my imagination and decided the mirror would look cool in my room. That was my first mistake. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The mirror looked great hanging on my wall, and I even started using it for selfies. But after a few days, weird things began to happen. One morning, I woke up to find the mirror's glass covered in fog, like someone had breathed on it. I wiped it clean, but later that night, the same fog was back. There were faint smudges, like fingerprints, except they were too long and thin to belong to anyone I knew. Then, objects in my room started moving on their own. I'd leave my hairbrush on my desk, only to find it on the floor across the room. My lamp flickered constantly, even though the bulb was new. Once, I swore I heard faint whispers when I stood near the mirror, but I told myself it was just the wind outside. But the worst part was the dreams. Every night, I dreamed of the mirror. In my dreams, my reflection would step out of the glass. She looked just like me, but her smile was too wide, and her eyes didn't blink. She would whisper things I couldn't understand, her voice echoing like it was coming from deep underwater. I woke up drenched in sweat, the whispers still ringing in my ears. I tried to tell my parents, but they didn't believe me. "It's just a mirror, Mia," Mom said, rolling her eyes. "Stop watching horror movies before bed." Even my friends thought I was overreacting. "You're just stressed about college applications," my best friend Kayla said, but I knew something was wrong. Things escalated quickly after that. One evening, I was home alone, studying for a history test. My room felt colder than usual, and the air was thick, like I couldn't breathe. Then, I heard it, a faint scratching sound. I froze, my pencil hovering over my notebook. The scratching grew louder, coming from the direction of the mirror. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. The glass was rippling, like water disturbed by a stone. And behind the ripples, I saw her, my reflection. She wasn't copying my movements. She was staring at me, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then, she raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. I screamed and bolted out of the room. After that night, I refused to sleep in my room. I camped out on the living room couch, but the strange events didn't stop. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more insistent. My grades started slipping because I couldn't concentrate. Kayla finally agreed to come over and check out the mirror. "It's probably just an old mirror with a weird vibe," she said. "I'll prove it's nothing." She stood in front of the mirror, her hands on her hips. "See? It's just a..." Before she could finish, the glass cracked with a deafening sound. Kayla jumped back, clutching her hand. Blood trickled from a deep cut across her palm. "I didn't even touch it," she cried, her face pale. That was when she believed me. Kayla and I decided to do some research on the house. We found out that the previous owners had left suddenly, abandoning most of their belongings. The husband had gone bankrupt, and the wife had mysteriously disappeared. Digging deeper, we discovered that the mirror had been in the house for decades. It was rumored to have belonged to a woman named Eleanor Blackwell, who was accused of witchcraft in the 1800s. They said she cursed the mirror before she was executed, trapping her spirit inside. Kayla and I were terrified, but we knew we had to get rid of the mirror. We tried everything. First, we covered it with a blanket and left it in the backyard, but the next morning, it was back on my wall. Then, we tried smashing it. Kayla swung a hammer at the glass, but the mirror didn't even crack. Instead, the hammer flew out of her hand and hit the wall, leaving a dent. Finally, we decided to burn it. We dragged the mirror to the woods behind my house and built a bonfire. The flames roared high, but the mirror remained untouched. That's when the whispers turned into screams. The air grew icy, and shadows flickered at the edge of the firelight. Kayla and I ran, leaving the mirror behind. When we returned the next morning, the mirror was gone. I thought it was over, but the strange occurrences didn't stop. The whispers still haunted me, and I often felt like I was being watched. One night, I woke up to find a message scrawled on my bedroom wall, written in what looked like ash. "You can't escape." I moved out of the house a week later. My parents didn't understand, but I couldn't stay there any longer. To this day, I don't know what happened to the mirror. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I see my reflection move when I'm not looking. And I'll never forget the feeling of those cold, unblinking eyes staring back at me. My name is Jake, and I never believed in curses. Stories about haunted dolls or cursed jewelry were just things you'd find in horror movies or urban legends, not something that could happen in real life. But now, I'm not so sure. It all started on an unassuming Saturday afternoon when I visited a thrift store with my girlfriend, Emily. She loved hunting for unique trinkets and vintage clothes, and I tagged along because it was better than sitting at home. While Emily browsed racks of old dresses, I wandered toward the shelves of miscellaneous items. That's when I saw it, an antique pocket watch. It sat alone in a glass display case, the golden surface tarnished with age but still gleaming faintly under the dim light. Its intricate engravings caught my eye, swirling patterns that seemed to shift when I tilted the watch. "Cool, right?" the shopkeeper said, appearing out of nowhere. He was a wiry old man with sharp features and piercing eyes. "Yeah," I admitted. "How much?" He hesitated for a moment, then said, $20. But a word of advice, son. Don't wind it up." I laughed, thinking he was joking. "Why not?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because once you start it, you might not like what happens." I bought the watch, of course. His warning only made me more curious. That night, back at my apartment, I couldn't stop staring at it. The engravings seemed even more intricate under the light of my desk lamp, almost as if they were alive. Emily thought it was creepy. "It looks like something straight out of a horror movie," she said, wrinkling her nose. "Maybe it's cursed," I joked, wiggling my fingers dramatically. She rolled her eyes. "Just don't come crying to me when it ruins your life." Despite her warning, I couldn't resist. I turned the tiny key on the side of the watch, winding it up until it clicked. That was my first mistake. At first, nothing happened. The watch started ticking, the hands moving smoothly across the face. It was kind of satisfying in a way, like bringing something old back to life. But then, weird things started happening. The first thing I noticed was the silence. My apartment is never truly quiet. There's always the hum of the fridge, the distant sound of traffic, or the faint buzz of electronics. But that night, everything went still. It was an unnatural kind of silence, heavy and suffocating. Even Emily noticed it. "Did the power go out or something?" she asked, glancing around. I checked, but everything was working fine. The lights were on, the clock on the wall was ticking, and my phone still had a signal. Still, the silence lingered, pressing down on us like a weight. The next morning, things got worse. I woke up to find the watch sitting on my nightstand, even though I'd left it on the living room table the night before. I figured Emily had moved it, but she swore she hadn't touched it. Then, time started skipping. It began with small things. I'd look at the clock on my phone, blink, and suddenly an hour had passed. Conversations with Emily felt disjointed, like we were speaking in fragments. One afternoon, I sat down to eat lunch, and when I looked up, the sun was already setting. At first, I thought I was just tired or distracted, but then I started noticing other changes. The watch's ticking was always there, no matter where I went. It was faint, but I could hear it in the back of my mind, steady and relentless. And then there were the shadows. At night, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, dark shapes that vanished when I turned to look. Emily saw them too. "Jake, I don't like this," she said one night, her voice trembling. "I think it's that stupid watch." I wanted to believe she was wrong, but deep down, I knew she wasn't. I decided to get rid of the watch. First, I tried throwing it away. I wrapped it in an old t-shirt and tossed it in the dumpster behind my building. But the next morning, it was back on my nightstand, ticking softly. Then, I tried smashing it with a hammer. The glass face cracked, but the ticking didn't stop. Instead, it grew louder, echoing in my ears until I thought I'd go insane. Finally, I tried taking it back to the thrift store. But when I got there, the shop was gone. The building was empty, the windows boarded up like it had been abandoned for years. By this point, Emily had had enough. She packed a bag and left, saying she couldn't handle the stress anymore. I didn't blame her, but that left me alone with the watch. The nights were the worst. The ticking grew louder in the dark, and the shadows became bolder. They didn't just linger in the corners anymore. They moved toward me, their shapes twisting and stretching. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find the watch on my chest, its hands spinning wildly. I stopped sleeping. Desperate for answers, I turned to the internet. I posted on forums, sharing my story and hoping someone could help. One night, I received a private message from a user named Timekeeper. "The watch you have is cursed," the message read. It was created by a clockmaker in the 1800s who wanted to cheat death. He poured his soul into the watch, but it backfired. Now, it traps the souls of anyone who winds it. How do I get rid of it? I typed back, my hands shaking. "You can't," they replied. "The only way to escape is to pass it on to someone else. But doing so comes at a price." "What price?" They didn't answer. I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were all there. The watch wasn't just cursed, it was alive. And it wanted me. The shadows became more aggressive, their forms solidifying until I could see their faces, twisted and anguished, like they were screaming silently. The ticking was deafening now, drowning out everything else. I couldn't take it anymore. In the end, I made my choice. I placed the watch back in its display box, cleaned it up, and took it to a pawn shop on the other side of town. The clerk didn't ask any questions as I handed it over, and I didn't offer any explanations. As I walked out of the shop, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. I knew I'd passed the curse on to someone else, but at least I was free. Or so I thought. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the faint, relentless ticking. And when I turned to look, the watch was sitting on my nightstand, waiting. I don't know how much longer I can take this. If you're reading this and you ever come across an old pocket watch with swirling engravings, don't touch it. Some objects should stay lost forever. I never should have taken the painting. I thought it was just another odd piece of art, a curious relic from the past that would look cool on my living room wall. But now, I'm certain it's something much darker. It all started at an estate sale. My best friend, Dylan, and I were killing time one Saturday, wandering through an old Victorian house packed with antique furniture and strange knickknacks. "Look at this," Dylan said, pointing to a large oil painting propped up in the corner of a dimly lit room. The painting was eerie but captivating. It showed a woman in a blood-red wedding dress standing in the middle of a forest. Her face was pale and emotionless, and her eyes were a striking green, almost glowing against the muted colors of the background. The forest behind her was dark and overgrown, the kind of place you'd avoid at all costs. What kind of bride wears a dress like that? I joked, though the painting gave me a weird feeling. "I dare you to buy it," Dylan said, grinning. The price tag read $25. It was cheap enough to make the dare seem harmless, so I bought it. I had no idea what I was bringing into my home. The trouble started almost immediately. The first night, I hung the painting on the wall above my couch. It dominated the room, its deep red and green tones drawing your eye no matter where you were. That evening, as I watched TV, I kept feeling like I was being watched. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but every time I glanced at the painting, the bride's eyes seemed different. They were too intense, almost alive. I tried to shake it off, but as the night wore on, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I turned the painting to face the wall before heading to bed, thinking that would help. It didn't. At 3 a.m., I woke up to a loud thud. I bolted upright, my heart racing. The sound had come from the living room. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept out of bed to investigate. The painting was lying face down on the floor. The nail it had been hanging on was still intact, as if it had been lifted off the wall and dropped. The bride's face seemed different, too. Her lips, which had been neutral in the store, were now curved into the faintest smile. My stomach twisted, but I convinced myself it was a trick of the light. I propped the painting against the wall and went back to bed. The next day, things got stranger. I worked from home, and as I typed away at my computer, I kept hearing faint whispers. At first, I thought they were coming from outside, but every time I looked out the window, there was no one there. The whispers grew louder as the day went on, low and murmuring, like a voice just out of reach. By evening, I was so unnerved that I called Dylan. "Dude, this painting is creeping me out," I said. "I think it's haunted or something." He laughed. "Haunted? Come on, Max. It's just an old piece of art. You're probably psyching yourself out." But I wasn't imagining things. That night, I had the first dream. In the dream, I was standing in the forest from the painting. The trees were tall and gnarled, their twisted branches blocking out the sky. The bride was there, her crimson dress glowing faintly in the darkness. She didn't move, but her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. "Why did you bring me here?" she whispered, her voice echoing through the forest. I woke up gasping, my body drenched in sweat. The painting was back on the wall, even though I hadn't hung it up again. Over the next few days, the dreams got worse. Each night, I'd find myself in the same forest, the bride standing closer and closer. Her whispers grew louder, her words more menacing. "Do you hear them?" she'd ask, her voice dripping with malice. I started noticing changes in the painting, too. The trees in the background seemed to shift positions, their branches reaching toward the bride like claws. Her smile grew wider, her green eyes brighter. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to get rid of the painting. I took it to a thrift store across town and left it there, refusing to look back. For the first time in days, I felt relief. That night, I slept peacefully, with no dreams of the bride or her sinister forest. But when I woke up, the painting was back. It was sitting on my dining table, propped up against the chair. The bride's expression was no longer neutral or faintly smiling. She was glaring at me, her mouth twisted into a grimace of fury. I screamed, knocking the chair over as I stumbled backward. Desperate, I turned to the internet for answers. I posted about the painting on a paranormal forum, describing its unsettling details and the strange events that had followed me since I bought it. One user responded almost immediately, "That's the Crimson Bride. She's cursed. Anyone who owns her painting suffers misfortune until they're driven to madness or worse. What do I do?" I typed back, "You can't destroy it," they replied. "Your only option is to return it to where it came from." I called the estate sale organizer, hoping for answers. "Do you know anything about the painting I bought?" I asked. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That thing," the woman said, her voice trembling. "It belonged to my great-aunt. She claimed it ruined her life. Her husband left her, her house burned down, and she lost her mind before she passed away. We've been trying to get rid of it for years. Why didn't you warn me?" I shouted. She sighed. "Because no one ever believes us. They think it's just an old painting. I'm sorry, but it's your problem now." I decided to take the painting back to the estate. Driving with it in the passenger seat was nerve-wracking. The whispers were constant now, louder than ever, and the bride's eyes seemed to follow me no matter how I shifted in my seat. When I arrived at the house, I left the painting on the porch and drove away as fast as I could. But that night, it was back in my apartment. It was hanging on the wall above my couch, the bride's smile wider than ever. I've tried everything to escape her, but nothing works. The whispers are deafening now, and the dreams have become nightmares. In the last one, she reached out and touched my arm. I woke up with a cold, burning sensation that hasn't gone away. I don't know how much longer I can endure this. If you ever come across a painting of a bride in a crimson dress, do yourself a favor, walk away. Some art is better left unseen. I'll never forget the day I found the black key. If I had known then what I know now, I would have left it where it was, buried beneath years of dust and forgotten memories. It all started when my dad and I decided to clean out my late grandfather's house. He'd passed away 2 months earlier, leaving behind a sprawling, dilapidated farmhouse filled with decades worth of clutter. The house had always felt eerie to me, even as a kid, with its creaking floorboards and the constant feeling of being watched. "We'll just box up what we can today," Dad said, trying to sound upbeat. "We can sort through it later." I nodded, already dreading the task ahead. By mid-afternoon, the attic was the only room left to tackle. The air was thick with dust, and the sunlight filtering through the grime-coated windows gave everything a hazy, golden glow. Most of the attic was filled with old trunks, broken furniture, and stacks of yellowing newspapers. It was while sifting through a box of miscellaneous items that I found it. The key was lying at the bottom, beneath a pile of brittle letters and tarnished coins. It was unlike any key I'd ever seen. Jet black, with intricate carvings that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. "What do you think it opens?" I asked, holding it up for Dad to see. He shrugged. "Probably nothing important. Your grandpa kept all sorts of junk, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was important." That night, I brought the key home with me. I wasn't sure why. It just felt significant. I placed it on my nightstand and tried to forget about it. But the key didn't want to be forgotten. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise. It was a low, metallic hum, like the sound of a tuning fork vibrating. Groggy and disoriented, I turned on my bedside lamp. The black key was glowing faintly, its carvings pulsing with an otherworldly light. I stared at it, my heart pounding. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the glow faded, and the key was still again. I told myself it was a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. The next day, I began noticing other strange things. Every clock in my house was wrong. My alarm clock, my phone, even the microwave, they all showed different times, none of which made sense. And then there was the whispering. It started faint, almost imperceptible, like wind rustling through leaves. But as the day went on, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. Then I realized the whispers were always loudest when I was near the black key. I decided to get rid of it. I wrapped the key in an old dish towel and threw it in the trash. That night, I slept better, thinking I was finally free. But when I woke up the next morning, the key was back on my nightstand. Its carvings seemed sharper now, more defined, and the faint hum I'd heard before was constant. I tried everything to get rid of it. I buried it in the woods behind my house, only to find it sitting on my kitchen counter the next morning. I threw it into a river, but it reappeared in my backpack hours later, soaking wet. No matter what I did, the key always came back, and with each return, the strange occurrences grew worse. By the end of the week, my dreams were plagued with visions of a dark, endless hallway. In the dream, I was always holding the black key, walking toward a massive, iron door at the end of the corridor. The door was covered in the same carvings as the key, and it radiated a cold, malevolent energy. Each time I reached the door, I'd wake up just as I was about to unlock it. But one night, I didn't wake up. In the dream, I slid the black key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a cavernous void filled with writhing shadows. A cold wind rushed past me, carrying whispers that sounded like screams. Something moved in the darkness, a massive, shifting shape that seemed to defy logic. It didn't have a face, but I could feel it watching me. "You found me," a voice boomed, low and guttural. I woke up screaming. The next morning, my reflection in the mirror didn't look quite right. It moved when I moved, but there was a delay, a split second where its eyes stayed locked on mine before following the rest of my body. And then there were the bruises. They started as faint marks on my wrists, like someone had grabbed me too hard. Over the next few days, more appeared. On my arms, my neck, my chest. I felt weaker with each passing day, like something was draining the life out of me. Desperate for answers, I called my grandmother. She'd grown up in the farmhouse and might know something about the key. When I described it to her, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Grandma, you found the black key," she said finally, her voice trembling. "What is it?" I asked. "It's not a key," she whispered. "It's a seal." "A seal?" She took a shaky breath. "Your great-grandfather found it in the ruins of an old church during the war. He said it was cursed, that it was meant to keep something locked away. He tried to destroy it, but he couldn't. No one can. The only thing you can do is keep it hidden." I told her about the dreams and the iron door. Her voice grew sharp. "You didn't unlock it, did you?" I didn't answer. "Max," she said urgently, "you have to listen to me. If the door opens completely, it'll be too late. You have to find a way to seal it again." "How?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but you need to try before it's too late. I've spent the past week researching everything I can about the black key. I've found stories, legends, really, about objects like it. They're called warden seals, created to imprison entities too dangerous to roam free. But every source says the same thing. Once the seal is broken, it can't be repaired. The dreams have returned, more vivid than ever. Each time, the door opens wider, and the thing behind it steps closer to the threshold. I don't know how much longer I have. The bruises have spread, covering most of my body, and the whispers are deafening now, a constant cacophony in my head. The black key sits on my desk, its carvings glowing faintly, as if mocking me. If you're reading this and you ever come across a strange, black key, don't pick it up. Some doors are meant to stay locked forever. Growing up, I'd always been fascinated by old clocks. The intricate gears, the steady ticking, the way they seemed to hold time itself in their hands. It all felt magical to me. When I inherited my great-uncle's collection of antique clocks after his death, I was ecstatic. Uncle Edwin had been a reclusive clockmaker. His house was more workshop than home. Every room filled with clocks of every shape and size. Most of them were beautiful, masterpieces of craftsmanship, but one clock stood out among the rest. It was a tall, imposing grandfather clock with dark, almost black wood. Its face was ornate, with silver hands and Roman numerals etched in gold. But what drew me to it was the inscription carved into the wood just below the face. Tempus nemini parsit. Time spares no one. I translated aloud, running my fingers over the words. That clock would change my life forever. I decided to move the grandfather clock into my living room, where its deep, resonant chimes could fill the house. The first few days, everything was fine. The clock ticked steadily, its chimes marking the hours with a hauntingly beautiful melody. But then, things started to change. The first sign was the timing. No matter how carefully I wound the clock or adjusted its hands, it never kept the correct time. It always ran a little fast or a little slow, and its chimes seemed off. They would ring minutes before or after the hour, sometimes not at all. One night, I woke up to the sound of the clock chiming 13 times. Bleary-eyed, I stumbled into the living room to check it, but when I arrived, the clock was silent. Its hands pointed to midnight, as they should have. I shook my head, chalking it up to a dream. But deep down, I felt uneasy. The next day, I noticed something even stranger. The air around the clock was cold. Not just a little chilly, but bone-deep, like stepping into a winter storm. The closer I got to it, the more I could see my breath hanging in the air. I checked the thermostat, but the rest of the house was warm. It was only near the clock that the temperature dropped. Still, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just a draft, I told myself. But the dreams began that night. In the dreams, I was standing in a vast, empty void. The only light came from the face of the grandfather clock, which loomed above me like a monolith. Its hands spun wildly, faster than any clock should move, and its chimes rang out in a discordant, almost angry melody. And then I saw him. A figure stepped out of the shadows. A man dressed in tattered clothes, his face pale and sunken. His eyes were hollow, and his bony hands clutched a pocket watch that ticked in perfect sync with the grandfather clock. "Time spares no one," he rasped, his voice like the creak of old wood. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. Over the next few days, the clock's behavior grew more erratic. Its hands would spin backward at random intervals, and its chimes became more frequent, sometimes ringing every 15 minutes, sometimes not at all. The cold around it intensified, spreading out into the room until I couldn't sit in my living room without shivering. And then there were the shadows. I started seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, dark shapes flitting across the walls and ceiling. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but one night, I saw something I couldn't explain. A shadow moved past the clock, but it wasn't cast by anything in the room. It was tall and humanoid, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. I froze, my heart pounding, but when I turned on the lights, it was gone. Desperate for answers, I decided to do some research. I searched online for anything about cursed clocks or strange phenomena associated with antiques. That's when I stumbled across an old newspaper article about my great-uncle Edwin. The article detailed his disappearance decades earlier. According to the piece, Edwin had become obsessed with building the perfect clock, one that could transcend time itself. He'd poured years into his work, isolating himself from friends and family. And then one day, he vanished. The only thing left behind was the grandfather clock. I reached out to a local historian who specialized in antiques, hoping she could shed some light on the clock's history. When I showed her a photo of it, her face went pale. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It belonged to my great-uncle," I said. "Why?" She hesitated before answering. "There's a legend about clocks like this," she said. "They're called death clocks. Supposedly, they're created by clockmakers who want to control time, either to extend their lives or to trap something inside. But it always backfires. The clocks end up cursed, bringing misfortune to anyone who owns them." "What kind of misfortune?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. She gave me a grim look. "Let's just say time has a way of taking back what's owed." That night, I decided to destroy the clock. I grabbed a sledgehammer from the garage and swung it with all my might. The first blow barely left a dent in the wood. I hit it again and again, but the clock remained intact, its surface unmarred. As I stood there, panting and frustrated, the clock began to chime. The sound was deafening, echoing through the house like a scream. I dropped the sledgehammer and stumbled back, covering my ears. And then, for the first time, the clock spoke. "You cannot stop time," it whispered, its voice deep and mechanical. The next morning, I woke up to find the clock's hands frozen at 3 minutes to midnight. I thought it was broken, but when I tried to move the hands, they wouldn't budge. And then I noticed the bruises. Dark, finger-shaped marks encircled my wrists as if someone, or something, had grabbed me in my sleep. The bruises grew worse over the following days, spreading up my arms and across my chest. I felt weaker with each passing hour, as though the clock were draining the life out of me. I knew I had to get rid of it. I loaded the clock into my truck and drove out to the middle of nowhere, a desolate stretch of woods where no one would find it. I dug a deep hole and buried the clock, covering it with dirt and stones. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. But when I returned home, the clock was waiting for me. It stood in its usual spot in the living room, its hands ticking once more. The bruises on my body darkened, and the cold around the clock seemed to seep into my very bones. Now, I don't know what to do. The dreams have returned, and the shadowy figure grows closer each night. The clock's chimes echo in my head, a constant reminder that my time is running out. If you ever come across an old clock with the words "Tempus Nemini Parsit" carved into it, leave it alone. Some timepieces are not meant to be touched. When my mom called to tell me about Aunt Clara's passing, I wasn't shocked. She'd been battling an illness for years, and it seemed like only a matter of time. What had shocked me was the inheritance. "She left you something," Mom said. "What?" I asked, confused. I hadn't been close to Aunt Clara, not since I was a kid. "A mirror," she replied. "A big, old antique one. She said in her will it had to go to you, The mirror arrived a week later, delivered by a moving truck. The movers carried it into my living room, grumbling about how heavy it was. It was massive, nearly 7 feet tall, with an ornate frame carved from dark, twisted wood. The carvings looked like vines at first glance, but the longer I stared, the more they resembled clawed hands grasping at something unseen. The glass itself was oddly dim, as though a permanent shadow lingered over its surface. I wasn't thrilled about it. It didn't match anything in my house, but I didn't want to disrespect Aunt Clara's memory, so I decided to keep it. That was my first mistake. The strange things started almost immediately. The first night, I thought I heard whispering coming from the living room. It was faint, barely audible, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. I checked the room, but it was empty. When I glanced at the mirror, though, I felt a chill. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in the glass, a dark, shadowy shape shifting in the corner of my vision. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was my imagination and went to bed. The next morning, I noticed something unusual. As I was brushing my teeth, I glanced in the bathroom mirror and froze. The reflection staring back at me didn't look quite right. It moved when I moved, but there was a delay, like it was playing catch-up. And its eyes, they didn't feel like mine. I shook my head and splashed water on my face, chalking it up to lack of sleep. But as I left the bathroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that my reflection was still watching me. The incidents grew worse over the next few days. Objects in my house began shifting positions when I wasn't looking. A chair in the dining room would be pulled out, a cupboard door left open, lights turned on that I was certain I'd turned off. One night, I found muddy footprints leading from the mirror to the center of the living room. They stopped abruptly, as though whoever, or whatever, made them had vanished into thin air. I scrubbed the floors clean, but the next morning, the footprints were back. I decided to do some digging. I called my mom and asked if she knew anything about the mirror's history. "All I know," she said hesitantly, "is that Clara got it from an estate sale years ago. She was obsessed with it, said it was one of a kind. She never mentioned anything strange about it." I pressed. There was a long pause. "She said it was cursed," Mom admitted, "but Clara was always dramatic." I didn't think much of it. That night, I had the first dream. In the dream, I was standing in front of the mirror. The room around me was pitch black, but the mirror was lit by an eerie, flickering light. As I stared at my reflection, it began to change. The face looking back at me twisted into something inhuman. Its eyes black as voids, its mouth stretched into a jagged, unnatural grin. "You belong to me now," it hissed. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The next day, I covered the mirror with a heavy blanket. I thought that would solve the problem, but it didn't. That night, I heard the whispering again. This time, it was louder, more distinct. "Come closer," it urged. "Look at me." I stayed in bed, too terrified to move. When I finally worked up the courage to check the living room the next morning, the blanket was on the floor. The mirror was uncovered, and the claw-like carvings on its frame seemed deeper, more pronounced. Desperate for help, I reached out to an antique dealer who specialized in cursed objects. When I sent him a photo of the mirror, he called me immediately. "You need to get rid of that thing," he said, his voice urgent. "I've tried," I replied. "I even moved it to the garage, but it came back inside on its own." The dealer was silent for a moment. "That's not just a cursed mirror," he said finally. "It's a portal." "A portal to what?" "To the other side," he said grimly. "And whatever's on the other side is trying to get through." Armed with this knowledge, I decided to destroy the mirror. I grabbed a hammer and swung it as hard as I could, but the glass didn't even crack. I tried using a crowbar on the frame, but the wood seemed unbreakable. No matter what I did, the mirror remained intact. And then the shadow appeared. It rose from the mirror like smoke, twisting and coiling until it formed a humanoid shape. Its eyes glowed red, and its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "You can't destroy me," it said, its voice a guttural growl. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "What do you want?" I whispered. "You," it replied simply. I don't know how I managed to sleep that night, but when I woke up, the mirror was gone. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. Later that day, I received a call from my neighbor. "Hey, did you leave something in my yard?" she asked. "What do you mean?" "There's this big old mirror leaning against my garage," she said. "It's kind of creepy. The mirror is still out there, somewhere. I don't know why it chose me or how to stop it. All I know is that I'm not the first, and I won't be the last. If you ever see an antique mirror with claw-like carvings and dim, shadowed glass, don't take it. Some reflections should never be seen." When my sister Emily passed away, the last thing I expected to receive was an old locket. It was small, tarnished, and unimpressive at first glance. The front had an intricate engraving of two initials, E and H. "I've never seen her wear this," I said to my mom when she handed it to me. "She kept it hidden," Mom replied. "Said it brought bad luck. But she specifically left it for you in her will." Bad luck or not, it was one of the few things Emily left behind. So I decided to keep it. I figured I'd clean it up and maybe even wear it in her memory. That was my first mistake. The first odd thing happened the night I brought the locket home. I had placed it on my nightstand before going to bed. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound, like someone whispering right next to my ear. I bolted upright, heart pounding, but my room was empty. The locket, however, had fallen off the nightstand and was now lying open on the floor. Inside was a tiny photograph of a man and a woman. They were dressed in Victorian-era clothing, and their faces looked somber, almost grim. I didn't remember opening the locket, but I chalked it up to a restless sleep and went back to bed. The next morning, I felt an unshakable unease. The locket seemed heavier than it should have been, as if something unseen weighed it down. I decided to put it on, hoping that carrying it would help me feel closer to Emily. But the moment the chain touched my neck, a wave of cold washed over me. It wasn't the kind of chill you get from a drafty room. It was deeper, like ice seeping into my bones. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just imagining things. By the end of the day, I wasn't so sure. I started noticing things. Whenever I wore the locket, I would hear faint whispers, almost too quiet to make out. At first, I thought it was the wind or the house settling, but the whispers always seemed to follow me, whether I was at home, at work, or out running errands. One night, I caught myself answering them. "Who's there?" I whispered aloud. The whispers stopped instantly. That's when I began to feel watched. The dreams came next. I found myself in a grand but decaying mansion. The wallpaper was peeling, the chandeliers hung crooked, and the air smelled of mildew. In the dream, I always stood in the same room, a parlor with faded furniture and a massive fireplace. The man and woman from the locket's photograph were there, sitting across from each other in stiff chairs. They didn't speak or move. They just stared at me with hollow, accusing eyes. I would wake up in a cold sweat, clutching the locket in my hand, though I was sure I'd taken it off before bed. The turning point came when I decided to do some research. I searched for the initials E and H and cross-referenced them with the locket style. After hours of digging, I stumbled upon an old newspaper article from the late 1800s. It told the story of a wealthy couple, Elias and Harriet Vance, who had lived in a sprawling estate not far from where I now lived. According to the article, their marriage had been tumultuous, marked by jealousy and accusations of infidelity. The article ended with a chilling detail. Elias had been found dead in the parlor, a knife buried in his chest. Harriet was never charged, but she disappeared shortly afterward, and her fate remained a mystery. The locket, the article speculated, had belonged to Harriet. That night, I dreamt of the mansion again. This time, the man and woman were standing. Elias held a knife in his hand, its blade gleaming even in the dim light of the dream. Harriet stood behind him, clutching the locket around her neck. "You must choose," Elias said, his voice cold and sharp. "Choose what?" I asked, my voice trembling. Neither of them answered, but the air in the room grew heavier, suffocating. I woke up gasping, the locket burning hot against my skin. The incidents escalated after that. Lights in my house would flicker and die whenever I wore the locket. Mirrors cracked for no reason, and my reflection sometimes lingered a moment too long. Its eyes filled with the same accusing look I saw in my dreams. One night, I woke to find the word liar scrawled across my bedroom wall in what looked like soot. I tried to take the locket off, but the clasp wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled or twisted, it stayed fastened around my neck, as if it had fused to my skin. Desperate, I reached out to a local historian who specialized in paranormal artifacts. When I showed her the locket, she visibly recoiled. "This is a mourning locket," she explained. "They were often used to hold photographs or locks of hair from deceased loved ones. But this one, it feels different, darker." I told her about the dreams, the whispers, and the strange occurrences. She nodded gravely. "It's likely tied to their unresolved deaths. The locket could be acting as a tether, keeping their spirits bound to this world. How do I get rid of it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "You need to return it to where it came from," she said. "Only then will they find peace." Following her advice, I tracked down the location of the old Vance estate. The mansion was a ruin, barely more than a shell of its former self. Trees and vines had overtaken much of the structure, and the air was heavy with the scent of decay. I entered the parlor from my dreams, the floor creaking ominously beneath my feet. The whispers grew louder as I approached the fireplace, their tone urgent and pleading. I placed the locket on the mantel and stepped back, unsure of what would happen next. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight. In the darkness, I saw them, Elias and Harriet, standing side by side. "Thank you," Harriet whispered, her voice soft and broken. Elias nodded solemnly before they both faded into the shadows. The locket was gone when I turned the flashlight back on, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. I haven't had a single dream about the mansion since that night, but sometimes, when the house is quiet, I think I can still hear faint whispers, like echoes of a long-forgotten regret. It all started when I found the pin at a local flea market. I was browsing through an old vendor's table of antiques and curiosities when I spotted it. The pin was unlike anything I'd seen before. Its sleek body was made of a dark, polished material that looked like obsidian, and intricate silver engravings spiraled along its length. The nib was sharp and golden, gleaming as if brand new, even though the pin had an aura of age. "Where's this from?" I asked the vendor, an elderly man with a weathered face. He glanced at the pin, his expression turning grim. "Take it if you want," he said. "No charge." I hesitated. "Why?" "It's brought me enough trouble already," he muttered before turning away. Curiosity got the better of me. I pocketed the pin, thinking it would make a cool conversation piece. I didn't realize it would soon become the centerpiece of my nightmares. At first, the pin seemed ordinary enough. I tried it out as soon as I got home, writing my name on a scrap of paper. The ink flowed smoothly, almost too easily, and had a deep, velvety blackness that seemed to absorb the light around it. The writing experience was almost addictive. It felt like the pen knew what I wanted to write before I did, guiding my hand with an uncanny precision. But the next morning, I noticed something strange. The scrap of paper with my name on it had changed. Instead of my neatly written name, there was now a single word scrawled in jagged letters: "Run." I laughed it off, convincing myself I must have written it as a joke and forgotten. But deep down, a knot of unease began to form. Over the next few days, I started using the pen more frequently. I wasn't sure why, but I felt drawn to it. Whenever I wrote with it, my thoughts seemed to flow effortlessly. My grocery lists turned into elaborate essays. My journal entries became poetic. The pen made everything I wrote feel alive. But then the writings began to change. One evening, I was jotting down some ideas for a short story when I realized the words on the page weren't mine. Instead of my planned plot, the paper described a gruesome scene. A man standing in a darkened room, his face twisted in terror as shadowy figures closed in on him. The details were disturbingly vivid. I stared at the page, horrified. My hand had written it, but I had no memory of doing so. The nightmares began that night. I dreamt of the man from the story, trapped in the dark room. He was screaming, but no sound came out. His eyes locked onto mine, pleading, as if begging me to save him. When I woke up, the pen was in my hand. and the word help was scribbled across my bedsheets in black ink. I tried to throw the pin away after that. I stuffed it in a trash bag, took it to the curb, and left it there. But the next morning, it was back on my desk, gleaming innocently as if it had never left. I decided to do some research. I reached out to a friend of mine, Alex, who was a historian. When I showed him the pin, his face went pale. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice shaking. I told him about the flea market. "This isn't just a pin," he said. "It's a ritual object. The carvings on it are symbols used in summoning practices. Whoever owned this pin used it for dark purposes." "What kind of purposes?" I asked, dread creeping into my voice. Alex hesitated. "It's said that objects like this can bind spirits, but the spirits don't stay quiet for long. They try to communicate. Or worse, break free." The next time I used the pin, it wasn't by choice. I woke up in the middle of the night to find myself sitting at my desk, the pin gripped tightly in my hand. My arm moved on its own, scrawling words onto the paper in frantic, looping script. The words made no sense at first, just random phrases and symbols. But as I watched, the writing shifted into something coherent. "You let him out. He's coming for you." My blood ran cold. I dropped the pin, but my hand burned as if it had been branded. A black mark, shaped like one of the symbols from the pin's engraving, had appeared on my palm. The strange occurrences intensified. Lights flickered whenever I entered a room. Shadows darted across my peripheral vision. I began to hear whispers, not faint and distant like before, but loud and close, as if someone were speaking directly into my ear. The dreams became unbearable. Every night, I saw the man from the pin's writing. But now, he wasn't just screaming. He was following me. No matter where I ran in the dream, he was there, his shadow stretching longer and darker until it consumed everything. Desperate, I went back to the flea market to confront the vendor. When I arrived, his stall was empty. A neighboring vendor told me he'd left weeks ago without a word. I had no choice but to find another way. Remembering what Alex had said about the pin being a ritual object, I decided to try a cleansing ritual. I didn't know what I was doing, but I figured anything was better than nothing. I lit candles, drew a circle of salt around the pin, and recited a prayer I'd found online. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the pin began to shake. The air grew heavy, and the shadows in the room deepened. A low growl echoed around me, followed by a voice that was both deep and hollow. "You cannot undo what has been done," it said. The pin burst into flames, the black ink oozing out of it like blood. I watched, horrified, as the ink pooled on the floor and began to take shape. It formed the figure of the man from my dreams. His face was twisted, his eyes burning with hatred. "You wrote me into existence," he hissed. "Now you'll take my place." I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up hours later, lying on the floor. The pin was gone, and the room was eerily still. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then I looked at my desk. A new pin sat there, identical to the first, and written across the paper in my handwriting were the words, "It's your turn now. If you ever find an old pin that seems too perfect to be ordinary, leave it alone. Some stories aren't meant to be written, and some objects are better left untouched." When I was a kid, I used to spend summers at my grandmother's house. It was one of those old, creaky places that seemed to hold secrets in every corner. Grandma loved collecting antiques, and her house was filled with things that belonged in another time. Porcelain dolls, oil lamps, and clocks that chimed at odd hours. But the one thing that always stood out to me was the music box. It sat on a shelf in her bedroom, a small, unassuming wooden box with delicate carvings of roses on its lid. Whenever I asked about it, Grandma would get this faraway look in her eyes and change the subject. "Don't touch it," she'd always say, her voice firm. Naturally, that made me want to touch it even more. I didn't dare go near the music box while Grandma was alive. There was something about her warning that stuck with me, even as a curious kid. But after she passed away, and her belongings were divided up, the music box ended up with me. I didn't want it, not really. It felt wrong, like it belonged in her house and nowhere else. But my mom insisted, saying Grandma would have wanted me to have it. So, I brought it home and put it on a shelf in my room. For weeks, I ignored it, though I could feel its presence every time I walked by. Then, one night, I decided to open it. The lid creaked as I lifted it, and a delicate, haunting melody filled the air. It was a tune I didn't recognize, slow and melancholic, almost like a lullaby, but wrong, somehow. As the music played, I noticed a small ballerina twirling inside the box. She spun gracefully, her tiny face expressionless. It was beautiful in a way, but unsettling too. I closed the lid after a few seconds, but the melody lingered in my mind long after it stopped playing. That night, I had the first dream. I was in a dimly lit room, not unlike my grandmother's bedroom, though it felt colder, emptier. The music box was on a table in the center of the room, its lid open. The ballerina wasn't spinning. Instead, she was standing still, her tiny arms raised as if reaching for something unseen. And then, she turned her head to look at me. Her painted eyes were lifeless, yet they seemed to pierce straight through me. I woke up gasping, my heart racing. The next morning, I found the music box open on my dresser, even though I was certain I'd closed it the night before. I told myself it was just my imagination or maybe a draft, even though the lid was too heavy to move on its own. But as the days went on, more strange things started happening. The music box would play on its own, the melody echoing through the house even when the lid was shut. I'd find it in different places, on my nightstand, on the kitchen table, once even in the bathroom. And then there were the whispers. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves. But they grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from the music box. I started hearing the whispers at all hours of the day, soft voices that seemed to call my name. At night, they grew more insistent, pleading and desperate. "Help us," they'd say. "Let us out." I didn't know what they meant, but the air around the music box felt heavier, darker, as if it was sucking the light out of the room. One evening, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed the music box and marched out to the backyard, intending to bury it. But as I dug the hole, the music started playing again, louder than ever, even though the lid was shut. The melody was frantic, almost angry, and the whispers turned into screams. "Don't do this," they shrieked. "You'll regret it." My hands trembled, but I forced myself to keep digging. Finally, I dropped the music box into the hole and covered it with dirt. The screams stopped instantly, and the night fell silent. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. That relief didn't last. When I woke up the next morning, the music box was back on my dresser, its lid open. The ballerina was spinning, but her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if she was struggling against something. And then I noticed the scratches. Deep, jagged marks covered the inside of the lid, as if someone, or something, had been clawing to get out. I called my mom and told her everything. She was silent for a long moment before saying, "I think it's time I told you the truth." She explained that the music box had been in our family for generations. "Your great-great-grandmother found it at an estate sale," Mom said. "It was beautiful, but strange things started happening after she brought it home. She said she'd hear voices coming from it, and everyone who owned it after her experienced the same. Why didn't anyone get rid of it?" I demanded. "We tried," she said, "but it always comes back. Always." Determined to break the curse, I reached out to a local historian who specialized in paranormal artifacts. When I showed him the music box, he recoiled. "This is no ordinary music box," he said. "It's a spirit vessel. Objects like this were often used to trap restless souls. Can I destroy it?" I asked. He shook his head. "If you destroy the vessel, you'll release whatever's inside. And trust me, you don't want to do that." I didn't know what else to do, so I tried locking the music box in a closet. That night, I woke up to the sound of the melody echoing through the house. When I opened the closet, the music box wasn't there. It was on my bed, the ballerina spinning faster than ever. The whispers had returned, but they were no longer pleading. They were laughing. The dreams worsened. I began to see faces in the dark, pale, hollow-eyed figures reaching out for me. The ballerina would appear too, life-sized, her limbs twisted and broken, her face contorted into a horrific grin. She would whisper in my ear, her voice dripping with malice. "You can't escape. In a final act of desperation, I took the music box to a remote field and doused it in gasoline. I lit a match, my hands shaking, and dropped it onto the box. For a moment, it seemed to work. The flames engulfed the wood, and the melody warped into a discordant screech before fading. But then the fire went out, and the music box was untouched. I don't know how to stop it. The music box is still in my room, and the whispers are louder than ever. The ballerina no longer spins. She just stands there, her painted eyes staring directly at me. I can feel something watching me, waiting. If you ever come across an old music box, no matter how beautiful it seems, leave it alone. Some melodies are meant to remain unheard. When I moved into the old house on Oak Street, I was warned about its quirks. The real estate agent mentioned creaky floors, drafty windows, and the occasional rodent problem, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found in the basement. The house was a fixer-upper, but I didn't mind. It had character, a vintage charm that spoke to me. I spent the first week cleaning and unpacking, ignoring the strange feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. It wasn't until I decided to tackle the basement that I noticed something truly unsettling. The basement was dark and damp, with a musty smell that made my nose wrinkle. I clicked on the single bare bulb, casting flickering light over the cluttered space. Old furniture, boxes, and broken tools were piled everywhere. But what caught my attention was the mirror. It stood against the far wall, taller than me, framed in intricately carved wood. The design was eerie, swirling patterns that looked almost like faces if you stared long enough. At first, I thought it was beautiful, a potential antique. I decided to clean it up and hang it in the living room. That was my first mistake. As I wiped the grime from the glass, I noticed something odd. My reflection didn't quite match my movements. It was subtle, a delay in the way my hand moved, or the way my head turned. I chalked it up to my imagination. But as the days went on, the mirror's presence began to feel wrong. Every time I walked past it, I'd catch something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moving when it shouldn't, a flicker of light that didn't belong. And then there were the noises. Late at night, I'd hear faint whispers coming from the direction of the mirror. I couldn't make out the words, but they sent shivers down my spine. One evening, I decided to test it. I stood in front of the mirror, staring into my own eyes. At first, everything seemed normal, but then, my reflection smiled. I wasn't smiling. The grin was wide, too wide, stretching across its face in a way that no human mouth could. I stumbled back, heart pounding, but the reflection stayed frozen, grinning at me. When I blinked, it returned to normal. I told myself I was tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the image of that impossible smile. Things escalated quickly after that. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They called my name, sometimes in my own voice. I started finding scratches on the mirror's frame, as if something inside was trying to claw its way out. One night, I woke up to the sound of glass shattering. I ran downstairs, expecting to find the mirror broken. Instead, it was perfectly intact, but on its surface, written in what looked like condensation, were the words, "Let me out." I tried to get rid of it. I hauled the mirror to the curb for trash pickup, but the next morning, it was back in the living room, leaning against the wall as if it had never moved. I gave it to a neighbor who liked antiques, not bothering to mention the strange occurrences. But 2 days later, he returned it, pale and shaking. "You didn't tell me it was haunted," he said, shoving the mirror into my hands before running off. Desperate, I decided to do some research. I found a local historian, Mr. Campbell, who specialized in cursed objects. When I showed him a photo of the mirror, his face turned white. "This is bad," he said. "Very bad." He explained that the mirror had a history of misfortune. It had belonged to a 19th century occultist who claimed it was a gateway to another realm. "Whatever's in that mirror isn't human," he said, "and it's been trapped for a reason." "What do I do?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. "You can't destroy it," he warned. "Breaking the mirror will release whatever's inside. Your best bet is to contain it." I took his advice and moved the mirror back to the basement, covering it with a heavy black cloth. For a few days, things seemed to settle down. The whispers stopped, and the house felt lighter, less oppressive. But then I started dreaming about the mirror. In the dreams, I was standing in front of it, my reflection grinning that awful grin. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and it whispered things I couldn't understand. Each time, I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the taste of fear sharp in my mouth. One night, the dream was different. This time, the reflection spoke clearly. "You can't keep me trapped forever," it said, its voice cold and hollow. When I woke up, the black cloth was on the floor and the mirror was uncovered. The carvings on the frame had changed. The swirling patterns now looked like screaming faces, their mouths open in silent agony. I decided to call a priest. Father O'Connell arrived the next morning, his expression skeptical but kind. When he saw the mirror, his demeanor shifted. This is not of God," he muttered, clutching his rosary tightly. He performed a blessing, sprinkling holy water on the mirror. For a moment, it seemed to work. The air in the room felt lighter, and I allowed myself a sliver of hope. But then the mirror began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that made my teeth ache. The glass rippled, like water disturbed by a stone, and the faces on the frame seemed to writhe. Father O'Connell stumbled back, his rosary falling from his hands. "You need to leave this house," he said, his voice trembling. "This thing, it's too powerful." I didn't leave. I couldn't. This was my home. But the mirror made it clear that it wasn't finished with me. Objects started moving on their own. Lights flickered, and the walls groaned as if the house itself were alive. One night, I heard footsteps coming from the basement. When I went to investigate, the mirror was glowing faintly, the yellow light pulsing like a heartbeat. And then I saw it. My reflection wasn't alone. A shadowy figure stood behind it, tall and gaunt, its eyes burning like coals. It reached out, its hand pressing against the glass. Cracks began to spiderweb across the surface, and I realized with horror that the barrier between us was breaking. I ran upstairs and called Mr. Campbell. "You need to seal it," he said. "Use salt, candles, anything you can. Do it now." I grabbed what I could, salt from the kitchen, candles from a drawer, and rushed back to the basement. The cracks in the mirror were spreading, and the figure's hand was now pushing through, its fingers impossibly long and sharp. I poured the salt in a circle around the mirror and lit the candles, chanting the prayer Mr. Campbell had given me. The figure screamed, a sound so piercing it felt like my skull was splitting. The mirror shook violently, the light inside it flaring brighter and brighter until it stopped. The glass was whole again, the glowing light extinguished, but the faces on the frame were still there, their expressions frozen in terror. I've left the mirror in the basement, covered once more with the black cloth. I don't go down there anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint hum of the mirror, like it's calling out to me. I know it's only a matter of time before it tries again. If you ever find an old mirror with strange carvings, leave it alone. Some reflections should never be seen. I didn't mean to buy it. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was wandering through a flea market just outside town. The place was a maze of mismatched furniture, dusty books, and old trinkets. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just killing time. That's when I saw it. It was sitting on a vendor's table, surrounded by antique candlesticks and faded photographs. A single, thick black candle, its wax smooth and glossy as obsidian. There was something strange about it, something that drew me in. "How much?" I asked the vendor, an elderly man with a hunched back and milky white eyes. He didn't answer at first. He just stared at me, as if trying to decide whether or not I was worthy. Finally, he said, $5. It felt too cheap for something so unusual, but I handed over the money. As he passed me the candle, he gripped my hand tightly. "Don't light it," he said, his voice low and grave. No matter what, I should have listened. I placed the candle on the mantel above my fireplace when I got home. It seemed to radiate an unsettling presence, like it didn't belong in my house, or anywhere, for that matter. But I shrugged it off. It was just a candle. The first night, I dreamed about fire. It wasn't like any fire I'd ever seen. The flames were black, swallowing the light instead of casting it. They twisted and writhed, alive and hungry, consuming everything in their path. When I woke up, the air in my bedroom smelled faintly of smoke. The days passed, and I started noticing small things. The room where I'd placed the candle felt colder than the rest of the house, no matter how high I turned up the heat. Shadows seemed darker, stretching further than they should. And then there were the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind or the hum of the fridge, but soon I could hear them clearly, soft, murmuring voices that spoke in a language I didn't understand. They always came from the direction of the candle. I tried moving it. I carried the candle to the attic, thinking I'd forget about it up there. But that night, the whispers followed me to bed. They were louder now, insistent, almost pleading. "Light it," they seemed to say. The urge to obey was overwhelming, like a compulsion buried deep in my mind. I had to force myself to stay in bed, my fists clenched tightly under the blankets. By the third day, I couldn't focus on anything else. The candle consumed my thoughts. I found myself standing in front of it for minutes at a time, just staring at its smooth black surface. The whispers grew louder, more persuasive. "What's the harm?" they cooed. "It's just a candle." I told myself I wouldn't do it, but the thought of lighting it burrowed into my brain, gnawing at my willpower. That night, I gave in. I brought the candle back downstairs and set it on the coffee table. My hands trembled as I struck a match, the small flame flickering in the dim light. As soon as the candle's wick caught fire, the room changed. The shadows deepened, pooling in the corners like ink. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew heavy, pressing down on my chest. The flame wasn't normal. It burned black, just like the fire from my dream, and its light seemed to suck the color out of the room. And then the voices began. They weren't whispers anymore. They were screams, loud, anguished cries that seemed to come from all around me. Faces appeared in the flame, their mouths open in silent wails. They shifted and twisted, merging and separating, their eyes filled with pain and fury. I wanted to blow out the candle, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped by the cold and the noise and the overwhelming sense of dread. The voices grew louder, forming words I could barely understand. "Release us," they howled. "Free us from the dark." I didn't know what they meant, but their cries clawed at my mind, filling me with terror. And then the shadows moved. They crept closer, slithering across the floor like living things. The darkness wrapped around my ankles, my wrists, holding me in place as the faces in the flames stared at me. "Light the others," they commanded. I didn't understand what they meant until I saw them. More candles, identical to the black one, began appearing around the room. They emerged from the shadows, their wicks unlit, their wax gleaming in the unnatural light. "Light them all," the voices demanded. "Finish what you started." I knew, deep down, that doing so would be a mistake. But the pressure was unbearable. My hands moved on their own, reaching for the matches. The first candle ignited with a hiss, its flame black and consuming. The second followed, and then the third. Each one made the voices louder, the shadows darker, the air heavier. By the time I lit the fifth candle, the faces in the flames began to take shape. They weren't confined to the fire anymore. They stepped out of the shadows, their forms twisted and broken, their eyes glowing with malice. They surrounded me, their mouths moving in unison, their voices a deafening roar. "Why did you bring us here?" they demanded. "I didn't mean to," I stammered, my voice barely audible over the noise. "You summoned us," they said. "You lit the flame. Now you will pay the price." The shadows closed in, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. The faces leaned closer, their features distorted by anger and despair. And then, just as quickly as it began, it stopped. The flames went out, the voices fell silent, and the room returned to normal. The candles were gone. I thought it was over, but I was wrong. The whispers returned the next night, louder than ever. Objects began moving on their own, books falling off shelves, doors slamming shut. And in the darkness, I could see them. The faces. They were always watching, their eyes glowing faintly in the corners of the room. I went back to the flea market, desperate for answers. But the vendor was gone. The space where his table had been was empty, as if he'd never been there. I asked around, but no one remembered him. It was as if he and the candle had vanished from existence. I don't know how to make it stop. The faces are everywhere now, and the whispers never leave me. They tell me I'm cursed, that the fire I lit cannot be extinguished. If you ever come across a black candle, no matter how beautiful it seems, don't take it. Some flames should never be lit. When my grandmother passed away, she left behind a house full of strange and beautiful antiques. She was a collector, and every corner of her home was cluttered with items she had picked up over the years: porcelain dolls, delicate glassware, and jewelry from forgotten eras. After the funeral, my family and I began the somber task of sorting through her belongings. It was during this process that I found the locket. It was buried in the bottom of a wooden jewelry box, wrapped in a piece of yellowed silk. The locket was small, made of tarnished silver, with intricate designs etched into its surface. Something about it drew me in. I unwrapped it carefully, the metal cool against my fingers. When I opened the locket, I found no picture inside, just a smooth, black surface that reflected my face in an odd, distorted way. "Be careful with that," my mom said when she saw me holding it. "Why?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "Your grandmother always said it was cursed. She wouldn't let anyone touch it." I laughed. "It's just a locket." But even as I said it, I felt a strange unease. I decided to keep it. I couldn't explain why, but the locket fascinated me. I cleaned it up and put it on a chain, wearing it around my neck. That's when the dreams started. They weren't nightmares exactly, but they left me waking up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. In the dreams, I was standing in a dark forest, surrounded by shadows that moved like living things. The shadows whispered my name, their voices low and menacing, but I could never see where they were coming from. Every time I woke up, I found the locket warm against my skin, as if it had been absorbing my fear. At first, I tried to ignore the strange occurrences. The lights in my room began flickering, but I blamed it on faulty wiring. Objects seemed to move on their own. My phone would be in a different spot than where I'd left it, or a book would fall off the shelf. But I told myself I was imagining things. The turning point came one night when I looked in the locket again. The black surface inside had changed. Instead of a reflection, I saw something moving, shapes swirling in the darkness, forming and reforming like smoke caught in a breeze. And then I saw the eyes. Two glowing, red eyes stared back at me from the locket's depths, and a voice whispered, "Let me out." I snapped the locket shut, my hands shaking. That night, the dreams grew worse. The dark forest was alive now, its trees twisting and groaning as if in pain. The shadows were closer, their whispers louder. "You have the key," they hissed. "Open the door." When I woke up, I found scratches on my bedroom walls, deep grooves carved into the plaster. I decided to take the locket off, but when I tried, the clasp wouldn't budge. It was as if the chain had fused together. I tugged and pulled, but the locket stayed firmly around my neck. Panic set in. I grabbed a pair of scissors and tried to cut the chain, but the metal was unnaturally strong. No matter what I did, the locket wouldn't come off. The whispers in the back of my mind grew louder, more insistent. "Don't fight it," they said. "You belong to us now." I started researching the locket, desperate for answers. After hours of digging through obscure forums and old articles, I finally found a story that matched its description. The locket had belonged to a woman named Eleanor Blackwood, who lived in the late 1800s. She was accused of practicing dark magic and was rumored to have used the locket as a vessel to trap spirits. When she died, the locket disappeared. Until now. According to the legend, anyone who wore the locket would become a target for the trapped spirits who sought to escape their prison. I tried everything to get rid of it. I buried the locket in the backyard, but the next morning, it was back around my neck. I threw it in a river, only to wake up with it still hanging from its chain. No matter what I did, the locket refused to leave me. The shadows in my dreams were no longer confined to sleep. I began seeing them in the corners of my vision, dark shapes that flitted just out of reach. I heard whispers even when I was awake, and every time I opened the locket, the eyes were there, staring at me, full of malice and hunger. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom completely dark. Not the kind of dark you get when you turn off the lights, but a thick, oppressive blackness that seemed to swallow everything. The air was freezing, and I could hear the whispers all around me, louder than ever. "Open the door," they demanded. "Free us." I felt something cold and heavy press against my chest, the locket, pulsing like a heartbeat. Without thinking, I opened it. The room exploded into chaos. The shadows poured out of the locket, swirling around me like a storm. The walls shook, and the whispers turned into screams. I saw faces in the darkness, twisted and monstrous, their mouths open in silent agony. And then they were gone. The darkness receded, the air grew still, and the locket lay on the floor, its chain broken. For the first time, I felt relief, but it didn't last. The next day, I noticed something strange. The shadows were still there, lingering at the edges of my vision. The whispers had stopped, but the air in my house felt heavy, oppressive. And then I realized why. The locket hadn't just released the spirits. It had transferred them. They weren't trapped in the locket anymore. They were trapped in me. Now, I see them everywhere. They follow me, their red eyes glowing in the darkness, their whispers always just out of reach. I can feel them inside me, clawing at the edges of my mind, trying to take control. I don't know how much longer I can hold them back. If you ever come across a locket like mine, don't touch it. Some doors are meant to stay closed. It all started on a rainy Tuesday. I was browsing through an estate sale in a neighborhood a few miles from my apartment. The house was old, creaky floors, heavy curtains, and rooms cluttered with old furniture and relics of another time. I hadn't expected to find anything interesting, but the moment I stepped inside, something caught my eye. It was a mirror, tall, framed in dark wood, with intricate carvings that twisted into odd shapes. At first, I thought it was just another antique, but there was something unsettling about it. It felt like it was watching me. I was drawn to it immediately, despite the odd, uneasy sensation creeping up my spine. I wasn't sure why, but I had to have it. The moment I saw the price tag, I thought I was getting a deal. "Does this mirror have a story?" I asked the woman running the sale, an elderly lady with a gentle smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She nodded, her gaze flicking toward the mirror. "That mirror belonged to the previous owner of this house. They say it's cursed." I laughed, trying to hide my discomfort. "Cursed? That's just an old superstition." The woman didn't respond, but she gave me a knowing look before turning away. I didn't think much of it. To be honest, I was eager to take the mirror home. It was beautiful, and I figured it'd make a nice addition to my living room. The first few days were fine. The mirror reflected my reflection just like any other. There was something mesmerizing about it, though. The way the dark wood frame seemed to stretch farther than it should, the slight distortion of the glass. I spent hours staring into it, even when I didn't want to. But things started to change slowly. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination, but then I began noticing odd details in my reflection. It wasn't always me in the mirror. Sometimes, I'd see a shadowy figure standing behind me. I'd spin around, expecting to catch someone in my apartment, but no one was ever there. Other times, my reflection would shift, just slightly, like I was standing a little to the left or moving a little faster than I actually was. One night, I woke up to find the mirror in a different position. It had been facing the wall when I went to bed, but now it was facing my bed, the glass gleaming in the dark. The room felt colder, the air thicker. The dream started the next night. I was in a room. No, it was a hall, lined with mirrors just like the one I'd bought. I walked down the hallway, feeling a pull toward the farthest mirror. The reflection I saw wasn't mine. It was a version of me, older, with dark circles under her eyes, hair disheveled and hanging limp. She smiled at me, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knew something terrible. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked. "Now, you'll never leave." The next morning, I woke with a start, heart racing, drenched in sweat. I looked toward the mirror on the wall. It reflected my room, but there was something off about it, distorted, like the edges of the glass were warping. I ran my fingers over the surface, hoping to calm myself. That's when I noticed something, a small crack, just beneath the surface of the mirror. It wasn't visible from the front, but when I touched it, the cracks seemed to ripple beneath my fingertips, as though the mirror itself was alive. Things started to spiral out of control. I couldn't explain it, but the mirror seemed to influence everything around me. The reflection in the glass began changing at night. It was subtle at first. I'd noticed the corners of my mouth twitching in a different direction, my eyes narrowing in ways I hadn't done. But over time, the changes grew more distinct. It started with my reflection moving on its own, no longer mimicking my actions precisely. When I moved to grab a glass of water, my reflection would pause for a moment, staring back at me with a look that wasn't my own. There was an expression of horror on its face, a fear I couldn't place. I tried to ignore it, but it became impossible. The feeling of being watched, even when no one was around, grew worse with each passing day. I could feel the mirror pulling me in, drawing me to it even when I tried to avoid it. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, like a voice I could barely hear. I thought I was just tired, but the voices began getting louder every night. The reflection in the mirror didn't just move anymore. It spoke. "You shouldn't have taken me," it said one night, the voice low and haunting. It sounded like my own voice, but older, more weary. "Now you'll suffer, just like the others." I was no longer sure if the reflection was me or something else. The longer I stared into the mirror, the more the other version of me took over. My reflection seemed to become the dominant presence, while I faded into the background, like a shadow lurking at the edges of the glass. By the time I realized I couldn't escape, it was too late. I began to lose track of time. I would wake up, and the mirror would be different, its surface more warped, the cracks spreading further each day. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd left the apartment or seen anyone besides my reflection. The whispers didn't stop, and neither did the pulling sensation. It was as if the mirror wanted me to come closer, to give in. I could feel it in my bones. Every time I tried to turn away, I felt a tug, like invisible hands pulling me back toward the glass. It was on a sleepless night when I finally understood what was happening. I stood in front of the mirror, my eyes bloodshot and my mind fraying at the edges. The reflection of myself stared back at me, only it wasn't me anymore. It was the woman from my dreams, her eyes wide, her mouth twisted into a cruel grin. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. "You're mine now," the reflection whispered, its voice no longer my own. "You'll never leave this place. Not ever." I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The room began to grow darker, the shadows lengthening and twisting. The air felt thick, like the weight of the room was pressing down on me. And then I saw it. In the reflection, the woman's hand reached out, fingers stretching toward me. I couldn't stop myself. I stepped forward, one foot moving into the mirror, as if pulled by some invisible force. The next morning, they found the mirror shattered on the floor. Pieces of glass were scattered everywhere, reflecting the light in strange, jagged patterns. But there was no sign of me. My apartment was empty, save for the cracked mirror. No one ever found me, and the neighbors only heard rumors of the strange woman who had moved in, a woman who had vanished without a trace. I don't know if the mirror is truly gone. Every time I pass a reflective surface, I see her. The woman with dark eyes and a twisted smile, waiting for me to step into her world, waiting for me to become part of the glass. If you ever come across an antique mirror, be careful. Some reflections are not meant to be seen. Some mirrors don't reflect what you are, but what you will become. It was an ordinary Thursday when I stumbled upon the doll in the antique shop. I was just browsing, looking for a new piece of decor for my living room. The shop had that musty, old smell, dusty books, faded furniture, and the faint scent of something sweet. The dimly lit corners of the shop were packed with trinkets, tarnished jewelry, and paintings whose faces seemed to follow you. It felt like one of those places where time stood still, the kind of store that only ever seemed to exist in small towns like mine. I wasn't expecting to find anything significant, but then my eyes locked on the doll. It sat alone on a dusty shelf, surrounded by other forgotten objects. At first glance, it looked like an old-fashioned porcelain doll, classic, innocent, and harmless. But as I drew closer, I noticed something strange about it. The doll's eyes were too lifelike, unnervingly bright. They didn't have that glassy, lifeless quality most dolls had. They seemed to sparkle with intelligence. I felt an inexplicable pull, a connection I couldn't quite explain. It was almost as if the doll was staring at me, waiting for me to pick it up. It was nothing like any of the other dolls in the shop, which were chipped and broken in one way or another. This one was pristine, almost new. I approached it carefully, and without thinking, I picked it up. The instant I did, a chill ran through me, like a shadow had crossed my heart. It felt wrong, but I didn't know why. "Are you sure you want that one?" The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with a face like crinkled paper, asked. Her voice was low and gravelly. She wasn't looking at me, but at the doll. I hesitated, suddenly feeling a weight in my hands that wasn't there before. I think so," I said, trying to ignore the growing unease. The woman gave me a long, hard look, as if studying my very soul. "That one's been here for a long time. Some people say it's cursed. Don't know how true it is, but it's never been sold." "Cursed?" I laughed nervously. "It's just a doll." She didn't respond, just nodded slowly, like she already knew how this would end. "If you say so." I didn't know why, but the doll haunted me in the days that followed. It sat on the shelf in my living room, its porcelain face ever watchful. When I went to bed, I would often wake up in the middle of the night with the strange feeling that it was watching me, its eyes seeming to follow my every movement. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than paranoia, but the unease continued to grow. Then the accidents started happening. It began with small things. A glass of water would spill inexplicably. A picture frame would fall from the wall. I'd drop my keys or misplace something, then find it in a place I'd never put it. I didn't think much of it, just bad luck, I told myself. But soon, things got worse. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, reading a book. The doll was across the room, resting on its usual perch. I didn't even want to look at it anymore. I could feel my anxiety growing, a tightness in my chest whenever I was near it, but I couldn't explain why. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. I jumped up, heart pounding, and rushed to check. A plate had fallen from the counter, smashing against the floor. I hadn't even been in the kitchen. It was as though something had pushed it off. But there was nothing there. No wind, no reason. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the broken plate, my mind racing. Then I heard it, the faintest sound, like a whisper. I spun around, but no one was there. My living room was empty except for the doll, and the longer I stared at it, the more the feeling of dread inched up my spine. The next night, the worst happened. I woke up around 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, with my heart hammering in my chest. The room was pitch black, and the air felt thick, suffocating. I couldn't breathe properly, the sensation of something wrong pressing in from all sides. And then I heard the laughter. It was soft at first, a low giggle that seemed to come from the corner of the room. I lay perfectly still, trying to convince myself it was a dream. But the giggling grew louder, more distinct, until it was a high-pitched cackle, childlike, but cruel. I turned toward the sound. The doll was standing in the middle of the room. It had been sitting on the shelf earlier that day. I was sure of it. But now, it was standing upright, its porcelain face twisted into a grin, its eyes glinting in the dark. My breath caught in my throat. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to close in around me, as if the walls were narrowing. The doll's eyes bored into mine, its grin widening, stretching unnaturally. I tried to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the laughter stopped. The doll was back on the shelf, sitting as innocently as ever. But I knew it had moved. I knew it. The next day, I tried to throw the doll away. I couldn't bear to keep it in my home anymore, especially after what had happened last night. It had to be cursed. There was no other explanation. But when I returned to the trash can to check if it had been picked up, the doll was back on the shelf, sitting perfectly still. I thought I was losing my mind. In desperation, I called the antique shop where I'd bought it. The woman picked up, her voice unsettlingly calm. "You can't get rid of it," she said simply. "Once it's yours, it never leaves." "What do you mean?" I demanded. "What's going on with this doll?" She was silent for a moment. "It's a doll made by a man known as the dollmaker. He used to make them for the children in his town, but something went wrong. He lost his own daughter, and when he made his dolls after that, they became vessels. He cursed them so they could trap the souls of the dead. Those who touched them, those who owned them, would become victims of their curse." I stared at the doll, horrified. "The curse is a slow one," the woman continued. "It'll start with small accidents. Then it'll escalate. By the time you realize what's happening, it's too late. The doll gets inside your mind, and you'll become its prisoner." I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. I didn't know how to get rid of it. I couldn't bear the thought of keeping it any longer, but I also knew I couldn't leave it behind. The curse was too strong. From that moment on, I was never truly alone. I could feel the doll watching me, its unblinking eyes always in the corner of my vision, its twisted grin never fading. The accidents became more frequent, more violent. I began to see shadows lurking in the corners of my home, hear the faintest giggles in the night. I realized too late that I was no longer in control. The doll had taken root in my life, slowly and methodically draining me of everything. I am still here, in my house, surrounded by the dark whispers. The doll sits on the shelf, waiting for the next person to pick it up. I hope they don't. I hope they don't make the same mistake I did, but I know they will. The curse will never end. The music box was an impulse buy, one of those things that catches your eye while you're browsing a flea market and just seems to call to you. It was small, about the size of a coffee cup, with delicate, hand-painted flowers and a brass handle. The moment I saw it, I couldn't resist. It was sitting on a table cluttered with old trinkets and knickknacks, buried under piles of vintage postcards and tarnished silver spoons. The vendor, an older man with a weathered face and crooked fingers, had told me it was an antique. From the early 1900s, he'd said with a crooked grin. It didn't look like much, just a simple, old-fashioned music box. It was more decorative than functional, but there was something about it that intrigued me. Its soft, delicate carvings and faded floral patterns had a nostalgic beauty, and I imagined it would make a lovely addition to my apartment. I had no idea that by buying it, I was inviting something far darker into my life. It wasn't long before strange things started happening. At first, it was just odd noises. Soft, tinkling sounds, like the notes of a lullaby, coming from somewhere in my apartment. I thought it was my imagination, or maybe the pipes creaking. But the noises persisted, and they seemed to come and go at odd hours of the night. They were never loud enough to be alarming, but they were persistent. I decided to investigate, wondering if perhaps the music box itself was the source of the sound. I'd bought it a few weeks earlier, but I hadn't really bothered to wind it up. I picked it up from the shelf, and to my surprise, it started playing on its own. The tune was eerie, not a joyful melody, but something melancholy and soft. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't quite place it, but there was something deeply unsettling about it, like the music was trying to tell me something. As the little box played its mournful tune, I felt a chill in the air, a coldness that seeped through the walls and wrapped itself around me. I tried to ignore it, but the unease only grew. The next day, I woke up to find my apartment in disarray. My books were scattered on the floor, the pictures on the walls crooked. A glass of water I'd left on the coffee table was now shattered, its contents spilling across the rug. I hadn't heard anything overnight, but it was clear something had happened while I was asleep. I bent down to pick up the broken glass and noticed the music box sitting on the coffee table, open, its tiny brass key slowly turning on its own. The tune was playing again, but this time, I felt a sense of dread wash over me as I watched it spin. It was almost as if the box was alive, its delicate metal gears clicking and turning without anyone touching it. Panic began to settle in. I tried to shut it off, but no matter how hard I turned the key, the box wouldn't stop. It played on, that same haunting melody, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. I wanted to get rid of it, but there was something holding me back. The music box had become a part of the apartment now, and no matter where I moved it, no matter how far I hid it, it always found its way back. That night, the true horror began. I woke to find the music box playing once again, but this time, I was wide awake when it started. The melody was different now, more frantic, as though it was urging me to listen, to understand something. The tune swirled around my head, and I couldn't seem to escape it. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, twisting in unnatural ways. I could feel something in the air, an invisible presence, something watching me from the corners of the room. And then, I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, in the reflection of the mirror on the far wall. A figure. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her face obscured by dark shadows. She stood still, watching me from the mirror, her hands twisted in a way that made my stomach turn. The music box played louder, its tune more frenzied now, until the woman began to move. She stepped out of the reflection, walking toward me in the dark. I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, as though it was no longer my own. I tried to scream, but my voice was strangled, a raspy whisper that didn't reach my lips. The figure reached for the music box, and just as her fingers touched it, everything stopped. The room fell silent. The woman was gone. I was left alone in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. The music box was still sitting on the table, its brass key turned, but the melody had stopped. I could hardly breathe, my mind racing with terror. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The world felt different, like a veil had been lifted, and I could now see things I couldn't before. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, and I couldn't escape the eerie feeling that someone, was watching me. I decided to research the music box, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. I learned that it wasn't just any ordinary music box. It had a history, one that was dark and twisted. The box had been created by a man named Frederick Finch, a well-known toy maker from the late 1800s. Legend had it that Finch was a brilliant craftsman, but his obsession with perfection led him down a dark path. He began experimenting with making his toys more than just toys. He believed that objects could hold a part of a person's soul, their essence, and he wanted to create something that would last forever. In his later years, Finch's mind became consumed with grief and madness. His only daughter had died young, and in his mourning, he turned to occult practices, believing that he could use his dolls and toys to bring her back. He used the music box in his rituals, attempting to bind the soul of his deceased daughter to it. But it didn't work. Instead, something darker took hold. The box became a conduit for malevolent spirits, trapping the souls of those who touched it in an endless loop of torment. I realized with growing horror that the music box was not just haunted, it was cursed. And now, it had attached itself to me. The days that followed were a blur of terror. I tried to leave, but every time I stepped outside, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the world itself was closing in around me. The music played constantly, even when I wasn't near the box. It seemed to echo through my mind, drowning out everything else. I began to see things, figures in the corners of my vision, fleeting shapes that vanished when I looked directly at them. At night, I heard whispering voices in the dark, murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The figure from the mirror began appearing more frequently, her face becoming clearer each time. I could see her eyes now, cold, lifeless, empty. And then, the accidents began. Every time I moved the music box, something bad would happen. A plate would fall from the shelf. A window would shatter for no reason. I'd stub my toe, or trip on something invisible. It was as though the box was causing these things, manipulating reality itself, feeding off my fear. I knew I had to get rid of it. But how? I tried burning the box, but the flames wouldn't touch it. I tried burying it in the ground, but the next morning, it would be back on the shelf, waiting for me. No matter what I did, no matter how far I tried to distance myself from it, the box wouldn't let me go. In the end, I realized the truth. There was no escape. The box had already claimed me, and now, like those before me, I was bound to it forever. I don't know who owns the box now, but if you ever come across it, whether in a flea market, an antique store, or even a yard sale, don't touch it. Don't even look at it. It's not a simple music box. It's a trap, a prison for the souls of the damned. If you're unlucky enough to buy it, you'll never be free again. And neither will I. It was a rainy afternoon when I first saw the mirror. I was at a small estate sale in an old neighborhood just outside of town. The house was run down, full of antiques and forgotten treasures, most of it covered in dust and cobwebs. The owners were selling everything: furniture, trinkets, even old paintings. Nothing seemed particularly valuable, just the usual clutter of people trying to get rid of their past. But then I saw it, hanging on the wall in the back corner of the living room. The mirror. It was large, ornate, with an intricately carved wooden frame. The glass was cracked in several places, and the edges were chipped, but there was something about it that drew me in. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't the clean, modern kind of mirror you'd find in a department store, but something more mysterious, more haunting. I approached it slowly, almost in a trance. There was something in the way it reflected the dim light of the room that made me uneasy, as if it held something beneath its surface, something that didn't belong there. I reached out, and my fingers brushed the cold, cracked surface of the glass. The moment I touched it, a cold shiver ran up my spine. The elderly woman running the sale noticed me and approached. "Ah, you've found the old mirror," she said with a knowing smile, her voice thick with age. "It's been in this house for generations. It's seen a lot, that one." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She paused, her eyes darkening as she looked at the mirror. "It's cursed," she said softly. "At least, that's what they say. People who've had it always end up with misfortune, broken relationships, accidents. The house, too. It's never been a happy place." I couldn't help but laugh. "It's just a mirror, right? I mean, it's just old." She didn't smile. Her gaze lingered on the mirror for a moment longer before she shook her head. "Just be careful with it, dear. It's not something to take lightly." I thought she was just trying to add some mystery to an otherwise boring sale, but the way she said it stuck with me. Still, I couldn't resist. The mirror was beautiful, and it felt like it belonged in my apartment, which was full of oddities and vintage pieces. I bought it, not thinking much about the woman's warnings. The first night the mirror was in my apartment, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. I placed it in the hallway, next to the living room, and admired it briefly before heading to bed. It was only after I turned off the lights and tried to sleep that I started to feel uneasy. There was something wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The air in the apartment felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I tossed and turned, unable to get comfortable. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was watching me, but when I opened them, there was nothing. Then, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from the direction of the hallway. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I thought I was imagining it, just the wind or a noise from the street. But the whisper grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone was speaking directly to me. My instincts screamed at me to get up, to investigate, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. And then, as if to make matters worse, I felt a chill, a sharp, icy coldness that seemed to seep into my bones. I glanced toward the hallway. The mirror was still there, just where I'd left it, but now, in the dim light of the room, I could see something I hadn't noticed before. A shadow in the reflection. It wasn't me. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It was a dark, indistinct figure, standing just behind the glass. It had no face, just a silhouette, but it was there, and it was watching me. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. The shadow didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was slowly creeping closer to me, inch by inch. I turned away, burying my face in my pillow, trying to block out the terror that was creeping into every corner of my mind. But the whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder. The next day, things started to go wrong. It began small, a little accident here and there. A glass of water I knocked over on my desk, my phone falling off the counter and cracking. I thought it was just bad luck, nothing more. But then I began to notice the pattern. Every time something went wrong, I would hear the whispers again, and every time I glanced toward the mirror, the shadow would be there, closer than before. It seemed to be drawing closer with every misfortune. I tried to ignore it. After all, mirrors didn't cause accidents. I told myself it was just coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something I couldn't explain. The more I tried to go about my day, the more things seemed to fall apart. My friendships started to crumble. I had arguments with people I'd known for years, friends, family, even my partner. It was like something invisible was pulling us apart, fueling misunderstandings and anger. I couldn't understand what was happening. One moment, everything was fine, and the next, I found myself alone, isolated, with no explanation for the growing rift between me and the people I cared about. That's when it hit me. The mirror, the whispers, the shadow. I had to get rid of it. I was convinced it was the cause of everything. The misfortunes, the accidents, the breaking relationships. I took the mirror down from the wall, but as soon as I touched it, a jolt of electricity shot up my arm. It was as if something inside the glass had reacted to my touch, something dark and powerful. I pulled my hand back, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. That night, the whispers were louder than ever before. The shadow in the mirror grew more defined, taking on the shape of a man. He was tall and thin, his features barely visible but his presence undeniable. I could see his hands, long, bony fingers that seemed to stretch toward me, reaching through the glass. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to destroy it. I couldn't live like this any longer, constantly haunted by the reflection of that figure. I tried to burn the mirror. I set it in the fireplace and watched as the flames licked at the edges, but the fire didn't touch the glass. It crackled and popped, but the mirror remained untouched, its shadowy figure still looming within. I called the elderly woman who had sold it to me, hoping she would know what to do. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the concern in her tone when I explained what was happening. "Throw it away," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "You can't burn it, you can't break it. The curse is too strong. You have to bury it deep in the earth. Get rid of it where it can't hurt you anymore." But even as I listened to her instructions, I knew it was too late. The mirror had already done its damage. It had already begun to take hold of me, and I couldn't escape. That night, I decided to face the truth. The mirror wasn't just an object. It was alive, feeding off my fears, my insecurities. The more I tried to fight it, the stronger it became. The whispers grew louder, the shadow grew darker. I couldn't leave. I couldn't run. Every time I tried to get rid of it, it found its way back to me. I spent the night sitting in front of it, staring into the reflection. The figure was there again, closer than ever before, and this time, I could see his face. His eyes were empty, hollow, like dark pools of nothingness. His smile stretched across his face, a grotesque grin that made my blood run cold. It wasn't until I heard the voice, low and gravelly, coming from the mirror itself that I realized the truth. "You'll never escape," the figure whispered, its voice sending a chill through my bones. "I am the mirror and you are mine." And that was when I understood. The mirror wasn't just a cursed object. It was a trap. It had been waiting for someone like me to come along, someone who would take it home, someone who would let it into their life. It wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway, a passageway to something far darker. Now, I can't escape. The mirror is always with me, its shadow lurking just behind every corner. I'm trapped in its reflection, doomed to live in its world forever. If you ever find an old mirror, don't touch it. Don't even look at it. You don't know what's waiting for you inside. It was a quiet, unremarkable Sunday afternoon when I found her. I had been browsing the local flea market, mostly just passing time, when something on a dusty table caught my attention. A doll. But not just any doll. She sat there, nestled among old toys and forgotten knickknacks, her porcelain face cracked and faded. Her eyes, deep and hollow, seemed to stare right through me. I couldn't quite explain it, but there was something compelling about her. Maybe it was the way she seemed so out of place, so full of history and secrets, or perhaps it was the way her dress, an old, faded blue with lace trim, reminded me of my childhood. But whatever it was, I was drawn to her, as if she were waiting for me to take her home. The vendor, An old woman with a hunched back and a voice as cracked as the doll's face noticed me eyeing the doll and shuffled over. "She's a special one," the woman croaked, her wrinkled fingers tapping the doll's head. "Not like the others. Some say she brings good fortune. Others say—" The old woman trailed off, her eyes narrowing. "Some say she's cursed." I laughed nervously, dismissing her words. "It's just a doll, right?" The woman's gaze lingered on me for a moment before she nodded slowly. "Aye, but be careful with her, child. Not all things are as they seem." I didn't take her warning seriously. How could I? It was just a doll, old, a little creepy, but nothing more. I handed over the money and left with the doll tucked under my arm, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. The first few days with the doll were uneventful. I placed her on a shelf in my bedroom, beside other old trinkets I'd collected over the years. But something about her presence unsettled me. At night, when the room was dark and silent, I could feel her eyes on me, watching me from across the room. It wasn't just the way her eyes seemed too lifelike. No, it was more than that. Every time I woke in the middle of the night, I would see her, still sitting there, unmoving, but somehow different. Her head seemed to tilt slightly to one side, as though she were observing me with an unsettling curiosity. I'd shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched never really left. And then the nightmares began. At first, they were just fleeting dreams, vague images of the doll's face, her empty eyes staring at me in the dark. But soon, the dreams became more vivid, more real. I dreamt that I was in an old, dark house, its walls crumbling and covered in cobwebs. The doll was there, sitting in a chair, waiting for me. I would approach her, drawn by an invisible force, and when I got close enough, her eyes would snap open, wide and filled with malice. She would reach out, her tiny hands grasping at my legs, pulling me into the darkness. I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling that the doll had followed me into the waking world. But when I would check her, she was always in the same place, sitting quietly on the shelf, her porcelain face as emotionless as ever. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the stress from work, the late nights, and the growing anxiety that had been building in my life. But things started to get worse. It started with small accidents. I would trip over things in my apartment, shoes that I swore I had put away, chairs that seemed to move on their own. I would hear strange noises in the middle of the night, soft scratching sounds coming from the walls, or the creaking of the floorboards when I was alone. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then the accidents became more dangerous. One night, I was in the kitchen, making dinner when the knife I was using slipped from my hand, slicing through my finger. It wasn't a deep cut, but it bled heavily, and I could feel a deep sting in my hand that wouldn't go away. As I wrapped the wound in a bandage, I caught a glimpse of the doll through the kitchen doorway. She was no longer sitting still. Her head was turned completely to one side, as if she were staring directly at me. I rushed to my bedroom, my heart racing, and there she was, sitting on the shelf again, perfectly still, as if nothing had changed. But I knew that something had shifted, and it wasn't just in my head anymore. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that seemed to cling to me. The doll, her lifeless eyes, the way she seemed to move when I wasn't looking. Everything felt wrong. That afternoon, I decided to confront it. I stood in front of the doll, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, half to myself. "What do you want from me?" But there was no answer, only silence. The doll didn't move, didn't speak, but something about the stillness, the absolute calm of it, was worse than anything I had felt before. It was that night, as I lay in bed, that everything spiraled into chaos. I woke to the sound of footsteps, soft, slow, and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my room. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, a product of my fear and lack of sleep. But the sound grew louder, closer, until I could hear the floorboards creaking under the weight of something heavy. My heart thudded in my chest. I lay perfectly still, terrified to move or make a sound. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. Then, without warning, the door creaked open. I held my breath. I could feel someone, or something, standing just on the other side. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive. And then, the doll appeared. She was standing in the doorway. Her porcelain face was now cracked, her once delicate features twisted in a grotesque smile. Her eyes were no longer empty, but filled with something darker, something ancient and malevolent. Her tiny hands reached out toward me, her fingers stretching and lengthening as if they were alive. I screamed, the sound coming from deep in my chest, as I scrambled out of bed and backed away into the corner of the room. The doll took a step forward, and I could feel a cold presence fill the room, a weight pressing down on me. The air turned thick and suffocating, and for a moment, I thought I might suffocate right there. Then, just as quickly as she had appeared, the doll stopped. She was no longer in the doorway. She was gone. I didn't wait. I grabbed the doll, still sitting on the shelf where I had left her, and rushed to the front door. Without a second thought, I threw her out into the yard and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely manage to lock it. I stayed up the rest of the night, afraid to sleep, afraid that the doll would come back. I didn't know what else to do, except to keep away from it, to not let it come any closer. The next morning, I awoke to a quiet stillness. The world outside my window was bathed in soft, golden light, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace. Maybe it was over. Maybe I was safe. But when I opened the door to check the yard, my stomach dropped. The doll was back. She was sitting on the porch, perfectly still, her porcelain face turned toward the door, as if waiting for me. I never went back to the flea market. I never sought out another object, not even as an innocent curiosity. I sold everything I could to move far away from that house, away from the curse that followed me. But even now, in my new place, sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear those footsteps. I can still feel her presence, watching, waiting. And I know deep down that it was never the doll that was cursed. It was me. If you ever find an old doll, sitting alone in the corner of a dusty shop, do yourself a favor, walk away. Turn around, walk out, and never look back. Because the curse doesn't just stay with the doll, it stays with you. It all started with a simple gift, a watch. But not just any watch. It was an old, silver pocket watch, worn but beautifully crafted. I had found it in an antique shop tucked away on a quiet street, one I had walked past hundreds of times without ever noticing. The shop was dusty and dimly lit, its shelves crammed with all sorts of oddities, old books, tarnished jewelry, and strange trinkets that looked like they belonged in a museum. The watch caught my eye because of its intricate design. The case was embossed with delicate patterns that seemed to shift and change when the light hit them. The face was simple, just a small, circular piece of glass with Roman numerals etched around the edge. But there was something about it that pulled me in. The vendor, an elderly man with sharp, almost unnerving eyes, noticed my interest and smiled. "Ah, you have a good eye," he said in a gravelly voice. "This one's special. It's been in my family for generations." I was drawn to it. There was something about the way the man spoke, the way he seemed to hold onto the watch as if it were a treasure. I didn't know why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to own it. "I'll take it," I said impulsively, reaching into my pocket for my wallet. The man's eyes twinkled, as if he had been expecting this. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. "Some say the watch brings misfortune." I laughed, thinking it was just another ploy to make the sale seem more mysterious. "It's just a watch, right?" I said, shrugging off his words. He didn't say anything more, but his expression darkened as he handed me the watch. Remember, time can be a cruel thing. The first few days after I bought the watch were uneventful. I wore it on a silver chain around my neck, admiring its beauty. It felt odd, but in a good way, like it belonged to me. But soon, I began to notice something strange. Little things started to go wrong in my life. At first, they seemed like simple coincidences. I lost my keys, spilled coffee on important papers, and misplaced my wallet multiple times. I chalked it up to stress and bad luck. But then the accidents started to become more frequent and more serious. I slipped on a patch of ice and sprained my ankle. My car broke down for no reason, and I ended up stranded on the side of the road for hours. It felt like a string of misfortune was following me, and no matter what I did, I couldn't escape it. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that the only thing that had changed in my life recently was the watch. Could it be that the man at the antique shop had been telling the truth? Was the watch cursed? I couldn't shake the thought. Every time I looked at it, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just the way it gleamed under the light, but the way the ticking seemed to grow louder at night, as if the watch itself was alive, beating with an eerie rhythm that matched my growing sense of dread. The worst of it came a week later. I had a meeting scheduled for the next morning, an important one that could decide the future of my career. The night before, I couldn't sleep. I kept tossing and turning, staring at the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the pressure of the watch against my chest, as if it was weighing me down, pulling me deeper into some unseen abyss. When I finally drifted off to sleep, I had a terrible nightmare. In it, I was standing in a dark, empty room, the air thick and oppressive. The only thing I could see clearly was the watch, resting on a table in front of me. The hands on its face were spinning wildly, faster and faster, until they blurred into a streak of silver. I reached out to grab it, but the moment my fingers touched it, I felt a cold, sharp pain in my chest. I tried to pull away, but I couldn't. It was as if the watch was connected to me in some way, draining my energy, pulling me into a void of nothingness. I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for breath. My heart was racing. My chest hurt as if someone had been pressing down on it. I glanced at the clock. It was already late. I had overslept. The meeting was in just an hour. I hurriedly got dressed, still shaken from the dream. But as I rushed to gather my things, I knocked the watch off my nightstand, sending it crashing to the floor. The chain snapped, and the watch fell open. Its face now cracked, the hands stopped at a weird angle. For a moment, I stared at it, trying to steady my breathing, but all I could think about was the pain from the dream, the way I had felt trapped by time. The meeting was a disaster. I arrived late, flustered and disoriented, and tried to explain my tardiness, but no one seemed to care. I fumbled my words, stumbled over every sentence, and before I knew it, I could see the disappointment in my colleagues' faces. By the end of the meeting, I knew I had lost the deal. The worst part? The watch was still around my neck, still ticking away, as if mocking me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just a series of unfortunate events, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something was wrong. The accidents, the bad luck, the nightmares, everything seemed to lead back to the watch. The next few days were the darkest of my life. The misfortunes didn't stop, they only got worse. I lost my job. I got into a car accident. I fell ill with a fever that kept me bedridden for days. Each time I thought things couldn't get worse, they did. It was as if the universe itself was conspiring against me, and the only constant in this whirlwind of chaos was the cursed watch around my neck. I tried to take it off, but it felt like I couldn't. Every time I reached for the chain to remove it, I felt an overwhelming force, an invisible hand pushing me back. It was as if the watch was holding me captive, binding me to it in some unexplainable way. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, the watch in my hand, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't keep letting the watch control my life. I needed to end it. I took the watch to the balcony, staring down at the city below. The streetlights blurred in the rain, creating an eerie, dim glow. It was the perfect moment. I opened my hand, preparing to drop the watch into the abyss, to free myself once and for all. But then, the watch ticked. It was as if the sound had broken through the silence of the night, a loud, persistent tick-tick-tick that echoed in my mind. I hesitated, and that was when I saw it. The shadow. It was there, hovering just beyond the corner of my eye. A dark, formless shape, its edges flickering like smoke. It moved slowly, but with purpose, creeping closer to me. And then, I heard a voice, low, almost a whisper. "You can't escape me." I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The shadow reached out, its tendrils curling toward me, and for the first time since I had gotten the watch, I understood what it wanted. The watch wasn't just cursed, it was a tether. It was a link between the world of the living and something far darker, something that had been waiting for me, for my soul. For as long as the watch had existed, I dropped the watch, but it wasn't enough. The days after that were a blur. I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. Everywhere I went, I felt a cold presence, a looming darkness that followed me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't shake the feeling that the watch had claimed me, and no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to escape, I knew that I could never be free. The watch was with me, inside me, a constant reminder of the curse that would haunt me until the end of my days. Now, I sit here, telling you this story, knowing that you might be tempted to seek out an antique shop to look for that same watch, that same feeling of power it once gave me. But I warn you, if you ever see it, if you ever feel that pull, don't run. Walk away. Leave it where it is. Because time is cruel. And if you take the watch, time will be the least of your worries. It was supposed to be a simple find, a piece of antique furniture for my new apartment. I had just moved to the city and was trying to make it feel like home, something familiar to ground me in the middle of all the changes. I had always been fond of vintage items, so when I stumbled upon an old, ornate mirror at a thrift store, it seemed like the perfect touch. The frame was intricately carved, with swirling patterns of vines and roses. The glass had a slightly smoky quality to it, as if it had seen decades of history unfold before it. The store owner, an older woman with a stern face and a voice that had a peculiar echo, noticed my interest and came over. "Ah, you have an eye for quality," she said. "That mirror has been in my family for generations." It's seen quite a bit. I nodded, impressed by its elegance, and inquired about the price. She hesitated for a moment before replying, "It's a bit expensive, but for a good home, I'd be willing to sell it." I agreed without hesitation, eager to get it back to my apartment. The mirror was heavy, and its frame felt like it could withstand years of use. I admired it all the way home, the dark glass reflecting the city streets in an eerie, distorted way. The reflection seemed off, like there was something just slightly wrong with the image it showed. But I shrugged it off. It was an antique, after all, and maybe that was just part of its charm. The first few nights with the mirror were uneventful. I hung it on the wall opposite my bed, feeling like it completed the room. There was something strangely comforting about its presence. But it wasn't long before things began to change. At first, it was subtle. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my eyes snapping open, and I would find myself staring at the mirror. The reflection would look different from what I expected. It wasn't like the image in the mirror changed, but the feeling I got from looking at it was unsettling, like something was watching me from the other side. I thought it was just my imagination, or perhaps the strange lighting in the room. After all, it was an old mirror, and old things tended to have an air of mystery about them. But as the days passed, the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. The real trouble began when I noticed a shift in my life. Strange things started happening. Little accidents, odd coincidences that felt too coordinated to be random. At first, I thought it was just bad luck, but eventually, I began to suspect that the mirror was at the heart of it all. One evening, I was getting ready for work when I glanced into the mirror. I froze. For a moment, the reflection I saw wasn't mine. Instead, I saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of my room. It was dark, almost formless, but it was unmistakable. It looked like a person, but there was something wrong about them, something unnatural. I blinked, and the figure disappeared, replaced by my own reflection once again. I thought I was losing my mind. Maybe the stress of the move, the new job, and everything else was finally catching up to me. But that night, I had a nightmare. In the dream, I was standing in front of the mirror, staring at my own reflection. The face in the glass was mine, but the eyes were different, empty, hollow, like they belonged to someone else. I reached out to touch the glass, and as my fingers brushed against it, the reflection smirked at me. It was as if the mirror itself had a life of its own, and I was nothing but a prisoner within it. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was worse, the dream, or the feeling that it was somehow connected to the mirror. It was as though something was trying to get through, trying to pull me into the reflection. The accidents got worse after that. I began to notice that every time I looked into the mirror, something strange happened. The reflection would freeze for a split second, as though it was out of sync with the real world. And then, when I blinked, the reflection would return to normal. But I could sense something was off, like the mirror was hiding something from me. One evening, I accidentally knocked over a glass of water, spilling it onto my phone. The phone short-circuited, and I lost all my contacts and important information. Another time, I sliced my finger open while chopping vegetables. It wasn't deep, but it bled more than I expected, and the cut wouldn't stop stinging. And then, one night, I came home late, exhausted after a long day. I was ready to collapse into bed, but as I passed by the mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The reflection was blurry at first, like the glass was fogging up. I stepped closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But then, as the mist cleared, I saw a figure standing behind me. It was the same shadowy figure I had seen before, the one that wasn't in the room, but was somehow inside the mirror. I whirled around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was gone. I could feel the weight of its presence, though, as if it was still there, lurking just beyond the glass. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the mirror's pull. I tried to avoid it, but it was impossible. The strange accidents continued, and my life seemed to spiral out of control. I couldn't explain it, but I knew deep down that the mirror was involved. One night, I decided to do some research. I looked up the store where I had bought it, and found a few strange accounts from other customers. Some people mentioned feeling uneasy around the mirror. Others spoke of accidents and bad luck after bringing it into their homes. But one account stood out to me. Someone claimed that the mirror had once belonged to a notorious family, one that had a history of tragic deaths and misfortune. I was horrified when I read that the mirror was believed to be cursed. Legend had it that anyone who owned it would be doomed to experience a series of unfortunate events, their lives spiraling into chaos and despair. The curse, it seemed, was linked to the souls of the family members who had died in tragic circumstances. The mirror was said to hold their spirits, trapping them inside the glass, where they could influence the lives of anyone who dared to own it. That was when I knew I had to get rid of the mirror. I tried to take it down, but the frame seemed to be stuck. No matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't budge. I even tried to pry it off the wall with a screwdriver, but it was like the mirror was holding on to me, refusing to let go. The more I struggled, the more I felt a sense of dread, as if the mirror was feeding off my fear. In desperation, I called the thrift store where I had bought it, hoping they could help. The woman who had sold it to me answered the phone. She sounded almost relieved when I explained what was happening. "I knew you'd come to this," she said. "The mirror is cursed. It traps souls, and it will never let you go. You can't escape it. You have to destroy it, but even that might not be enough. The curse is stronger than you realize." I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the weight of her words. I didn't know what to do anymore. It was as if the mirror had become a part of my life, woven into my fate. I had to get rid of it, but I didn't know if I could. A few days later, I gathered what little courage I had left and decided to destroy the mirror. I took it out into the backyard, praying that this would be the end of it. I grabbed a hammer and swung it at the glass. The sound of shattering glass echoed in the night, but when I looked down, the mirror was still intact. There were cracks in the glass, but it wasn't broken. It was as if the mirror was mocking me, refusing to be destroyed. The shadowy figure appeared again, standing in the reflection, but this time, it wasn't just in the mirror. It was in the yard with me. I turned and ran, throwing the hammer aside. I couldn't outrun the feeling of dread that consumed me, and I knew, deep down, that the mirror would never let me go. If you ever find an old mirror, one that feels just a little too heavy, a little too perfect, don't buy it. Don't bring it into your home, because once you do, you might never be able to leave it behind. And if you find yourself staring into its reflection one day, remember this: you're not just seeing yourself. You're seeing the souls trapped within it, waiting for their chance to claim you too. I never believed in superstitions. My friends used to joke that I had an irrational fear of things that go bump in the night, but I was always the logical one. Ghosts, curses, and haunted objects were just tales to scare children, or so I thought. I grew up in a family that was strictly practical. My father was a scientist, and my mother, a teacher. The idea of anything beyond the physical world seemed absurd to me. That was until I found the music box. I first saw it at a flea market on a Sunday afternoon. The sun was out, and the air was warm. Perfect weather for walking around and picking up little trinkets. The flea market was in a dusty corner of the city, a place full of old furniture, forgotten books, and knickknacks that smelled of age and history. Most of the items there weren't anything special, just things that people no longer needed or wanted. But as I wandered through the maze of tables, I spotted a small booth tucked away in the back, near a row of old paintings. There, on a wooden table, was a music box. It was beautiful, small, intricately carved, and made of a dark, rich wood. Its lid was painted with delicate roses, and the brass key that wound it had a strange, ancient look to it. I wasn't looking for a music box, but there was something about this one that drew me in. It seemed almost too perfect. The box wasn't like anything I had ever seen before. I asked the elderly woman behind the booth about it. "It's very old," she said, her voice soft and hushed. "Been in my family for generations. Some say it's cursed, but I don't believe in that nonsense. Still, it's never been sold to anyone who didn't regret it. I'm just trying to get rid of it, but I suppose you'll be the next one to take it home." Her words struck me as odd, but I shrugged them off. "I'll take it," I said. I had no reason to believe her story. After all, curses were just myths. The price was surprisingly low, so I handed over the cash, and the woman wrapped the music box up in an old cloth. I felt a slight unease as she handed it to me, but I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. After all, I was just buying a music box. The first night I played it, everything seemed fine. I wound the brass key and lifted the lid. The soft, haunting melody that played was beautiful, gentle, like something from a dream. It was a lullaby of sorts, a song that seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I had heard it before. I stared at the box, mesmerized by the tiny ballerina that spun gracefully inside as the music played. But then, things started to feel off. The next morning, I woke up to find my phone's screen cracked, even though I hadn't dropped it. The night before, I had put it on the nightstand, right next to the music box. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it had slipped off the edge, or maybe I had knocked it in my sleep. But it was the first of many strange occurrences. The second incident happened a week later. I went to visit my parents for the weekend, and as I was getting ready to leave, I noticed that my car had a flat tire. It was the strangest thing. I had just had the tires checked the week before, and there was no reason for it to be flat. I called roadside assistance, but it took forever for them to arrive. I ended up being late, and my parents were upset, though they didn't know the real reason for my tardiness. The third incident was even stranger. I had left the music box on the windowsill, out of the way, and went to bed early one night. I woke up in the middle of the night, startled by a sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking on the wall. It was coming from the direction of the music box. Groggily, I stood up to investigate, but when I reached the windowsill, there was no sound. The music box sat still, its lid closed. I dismissed it as a bad dream and went back to bed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Over the next few weeks, the incidents began to escalate. I spilled coffee on my favorite shirt, missed important appointments, and experienced increasingly bizarre accidents. Every time something went wrong, I couldn't help but feel that the music box was somehow responsible. It wasn't just bad luck. It was as if the box was influencing my life in ways I couldn't explain. The worst of it came one night when I returned home from work. I walked into my apartment, and everything seemed fine at first. But then I noticed that the music box was playing. I hadn't wound it up, and I hadn't even touched it. It was just playing by itself. The melody was the same as always, but this time, it sounded different. There was a discordant note hidden in the song, like a warning. The ballerina inside was spinning too quickly, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if she was struggling to keep up with the music. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, I remembered the woman at the flea market. her cryptic words echoing in my mind. Some say it's cursed, but I don't believe in that nonsense. I hadn't taken her seriously, but now, with the music box playing on its own, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something dark was attached to it. I tried to shut it off, but the key wouldn't turn. I yanked at it, desperate to stop the incessant music, but it was as if the box had a mind of its own. The melody grew louder, more frantic, the ballerina spinning faster and faster. I could hear her faint, high-pitched laughter now. Was it my imagination? It felt like something was coming through the box, reaching out to me. In a panic, I grabbed the music box and threw it across the room. The instant it hit the floor, the music stopped, but the room felt cold, unnaturally cold. I looked around, my breath coming out in visible puffs. A shadow seemed to loom in the corner of the room, though when I turned to face it, there was nothing there. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew something was terribly wrong with the music box, but I didn't know how to fix it. I grabbed it again, trembling, and stared at it. The once beautiful roses on the lid now seemed darker, more sinister. The brass key gleamed with a cold light. That night, I did some research, looking up the music box online. I found a few old stories about cursed objects, but one in particular stood out. It was about a woman who had bought a similar music box, and the horrible events that followed. She spoke of how the music would play on its own, how the people around her began to suffer inexplicable misfortunes, and how the box seemed to feed off her fear. The woman had tried everything, throwing it away, locking it up, but nothing worked. Eventually, she disappeared, and the box was left behind, ready to claim its next victim. The more I read, the more I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. I had to get rid of the music box, but I had no idea how. Every attempt to destroy it had failed. Every attempt to break free from its influence only seemed to draw me further in. The days after that were a blur of fear and anxiety. I couldn't escape the music box, no matter how hard I tried. It haunted me, played its twisted melody in my mind, even when it wasn't in the room. My life continued to spiral out of control. Broken relationships, lost jobs, strange accidents, and I knew, deep down, that it was all because of the cursed music box. One evening, I took the box outside and buried it in the backyard, hoping that if I buried it deep enough, it would finally be gone. But the next morning, I found it on my front doorstep, the music playing faintly as if it had never left. The ballerina inside spun wildly, her face twisted in a grotesque grin. I was no longer in control of my own life. The box had taken over. To this day, I don't know how to destroy the music box. I've tried everything I can think of, but it always comes back. Every time I try to bury it, or throw it away, or burn it, it returns, more powerful, more insistent than before. The only advice I can give is this. If you ever see a music box, one that seems too perfect, too haunting, don't buy it. Don't touch it, because once it's in your hands, it will own you, and there's no way to escape. It has a mind of its own, and once you've played its song, you'll never be free again. It was the day before my 21st birthday when I stumbled upon the pocket watch. I was at a flea market, perusing through old trinkets and forgotten treasures when something caught my eye. It wasn't the old furniture or the dusty porcelain dolls, but a small, tarnished silver pocket watch resting in a velvet-lined box. The watch had intricate engravings, swirling patterns and delicate symbols that seemed to dance in the light. The glass was cracked, but the hands on the dial still moved, ticking away in a rhythm that felt strangely hypnotic. I was drawn to it instantly, my fingers itching to touch it. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a sharp gaze, noticed my interest and walked over. "Ah, you've got a good eye," he said, his voice rasping. "That watch has been in my family for years. It's an old heirloom." But he hesitated, casting a wary glance around. "Some say it's cursed. If you ask me, it's just an old piece of junk, but I'd still be careful with it." His warning struck me as odd. A cursed pocket watch? It sounded like something out of a storybook. I smiled politely, dismissing his words as nothing more than a sales pitch. "How much for it?" I asked, trying not to sound too eager. He raised an eyebrow. "For you? $100. I agreed without hesitation. It wasn't a small sum, but something about the watch seemed special, unlike anything I had ever seen before. I took it home with me that afternoon, excited about my new acquisition. The first few days with the pocket watch were uneventful. I kept it in my bedroom, on a shelf next to my bed, where I could admire the strange design. I'd wind it every now and then, and the soft ticking would echo in the quiet room, a reminder of its odd beauty. I didn't think much of the shopkeeper's warning, chalking it up to superstition. But then, on the night before my birthday, strange things began to happen. I woke up around 3 a.m., feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The room was dark, but something felt wrong, unnaturally still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. As I turned over in bed, my eyes fell on the pocket watch, which was sitting on the shelf as usual. But tonight, something was different. The hands on the watch weren't moving at all. They were stuck, frozen at exactly 3 a.m. I dismissed it as a malfunction. After all, the watch was old. But when I reached out to move it, I felt an icy chill emanating from it, a cold that seemed to seep into my skin. I quickly pulled my hand away and turned over, trying to ignore the strange sensation. I figured it was just my imagination, but sleep didn't come easily after that. I tossed and turned for hours, feeling as though I couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of unease. And when I finally did fall asleep, I dreamed of the watch. In the dream, I saw myself standing in front of a mirror. I reached up to touch my face, but when I looked into the reflection, my eyes were empty, hollow. Behind me, I saw the pocket watch, its hands moving backward, ticking in reverse, as though it was unraveling time itself. The air grew cold, and the ticking grew louder, echoing in my ears until I woke up, drenched in sweat. The next morning, I didn't feel any better. I tried to shake off the dream and the eerie feeling that had been lingering ever since I had gotten the watch. But as the day wore on, things started to go wrong. Little things at first, but they added up quickly. My birthday was supposed to be a fun, celebratory day, but everything went wrong. I woke up late, missing the brunch I had planned with my friends. My car wouldn't start, and I had to wait an hour for roadside assistance. When I finally made it to the restaurant, the waiter spilled water all over me. As if that wasn't enough, I got a call from my bank notifying me that my account had been hacked. I had no idea how it happened, but the damage was done, and my credit card was maxed out. And then there was the watch. When I returned home that evening, exhausted and frustrated, I noticed something odd. The pocket watch was no longer on the shelf. I searched the room, my heart racing, but it was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until I noticed the faint ticking sound that I realized where it was. The watch was on the floor, under my bed, ticking away steadily as if nothing was wrong. I picked it up, feeling a strange compulsion to wind it. The moment I touched the brass key, the room seemed to grow colder. I quickly set it back on the shelf, but the unease lingered. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences continued. My phone malfunctioned, sending strange messages to my friends, none of which I remembered typing. I spilled drinks everywhere I went, and my car, despite being fixed, broke down again. But the worst thing happened the night I decided to get rid of the watch. I had had enough. I knew that the watch was cursed, and I couldn't stand the way it was affecting my life. I packed it up in a box and drove to a remote lake outside of town, intending to throw it in and be done with it. The last thing I wanted was to be haunted by some object that was ruining my life. When I reached the lake, I got out of the car, my hands trembling as I opened the box. The pocket watch was still there, gleaming under the moonlight, as if it was calling to me. I stood at the edge of the water, holding it in my hands, about to toss it in. But then, I heard the ticking. It wasn't just the sound of the watch. It was louder than ever, and the closer I got to the water, the more frantic the ticking became. I froze, unable to move as I watched the hands of the watch spin faster and faster. My pulse raced as I felt a cold, almost tangible presence behind me. I turned around, expecting to see someone, but the woods were empty. And then I felt it, a sharp pain in my chest, as though something had pierced my heart. I gasped for air, clutching my chest, but when I looked down, there was nothing there. The pain intensified, and I could hear a whispering voice, soft and distant, but growing louder. Don't! Throw it away. It was the same voice I had heard in the dream, cold and hollow, but this time, it wasn't in my head. It was real. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding me. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. The watch fell from my hand, landing in the dirt. I don't remember how I got home, but when I woke up the next morning, I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat. The room was still cold, and the watch was on the shelf again, ticking steadily as if nothing had happened. I thought I had dreamed it all, but I knew deep down that I hadn't. Since then, my life has only gotten worse. The watch has a hold over me. It's as if it controls time itself, bending it to its will. The more I try to escape, the more I lose. My relationships are falling apart, my job is at risk, and every day feels like a constant struggle against the inevitable pull of the watch. I tried to return it to the shop, but when I went back, the shop was gone, replaced by an empty lot. The elderly man was nowhere to be found. I don't know how to destroy it, but I know I can't keep living like this. Every time I think I've escaped, the watch finds its way back to me. It's always there, ticking away in the background of my life, a constant reminder of the curse that controls me. If you ever see a pocket watch with intricate engravings, with hands that seem to move too slowly or too quickly, don't buy it. Don't even touch it, because once it's in your possession, it will never let you go. The curse will follow you, and there will be no escaping it. Time is no longer on my side, and soon, it won't be on yours either. There are things you don't fully believe until they happen to you. Things that you hear about in stories, but never think could be real. Until your world starts to shift in ways you can't explain, and suddenly, you're trapped in a nightmare. It started with an antique mirror. I found it in a small, unremarkable shop while walking down an alley I passed by every day but had never noticed before. The shop was tucked between two taller buildings, its window fogged up with dust and cobwebs. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the inside smelled of old wood, dried herbs, and something faintly metallic. "Can I help you, dear?" The voice was soft, almost like a whisper, and I turned to find an old woman standing behind the counter. She had a frail, pale face, her hair gray and pulled into a bun. Her eyes were a deep, unsettling shade of black, and her thin lips stretched into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I nodded, unsure of what to say. The shop was full of oddities, faded paintings, dusty books, strange sculptures, but what caught my eye was the mirror. It wasn't large, only about 2 feet tall, framed in dark wood with intricate carvings of animals and twisted vines. But there was something about it, something that pulled me in. It wasn't just the way the light seemed to play across its surface, but the feeling it gave off. It wasn't the reflection I saw in the mirror. It was more like the reflection was pulling me into itself, inviting me to look deeper. "Do you know about the history of this one?" I asked, pointing to the mirror. The woman's smile faltered slightly, and for the briefest moment, a shadow passed across her face. But then she straightened, her voice colder now. "It's an old piece. It comes from a family that, well, that's not important." She paused and studied me for a moment before continuing. "Some say it's cursed, but if you're not superstitious, it might just make a beautiful addition to your home." I didn't know why, but her words made my stomach tighten. The word cursed shouldn't have been enough to make me hesitate, but it did. However, something in the way the woman said it, her strange hesitance, made me feel like I had no choice. The urge to own the mirror was overwhelming, and before I knew it, I was pulling my wallet out and handing her the money. That night, I hung the mirror in my bedroom. It seemed to fit perfectly above my dresser, the dark wood blending in with the rest of my furniture. I stood there for a moment, admiring how it looked. Everything was so perfect, so right, but there was something off about it. I couldn't explain why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone when I stood in front of it. It was as though I could feel a presence, something cold, lurking in the reflection. I glanced over my shoulders several times, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was never anyone there. It was just me and the mirror. Still, I pushed the feeling aside. It was just my imagination, right? But then things started happening. At first, it was subtle. I would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating and disoriented, as if something had disturbed my sleep. I would glance at the mirror and, for a split second, thought I saw shadows moving within it. But when I looked again, it was just my reflection. I convinced myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, maybe. But then, the accident started. The first one was a small, simple mishap. I was late for work, rushing through my morning routine when I reached for my toothbrush, only to knock it off the counter and into the sink. It wasn't a big deal, but it was annoying. I bent down to retrieve it and noticed that the sink was strangely cold, almost as though the water running through it was ice cold. I didn't think much of it, but it was the first sign of something wrong. The second incident was more unsettling. I woke up one morning with a terrible headache, my vision blurry and my body feeling drained. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. For a split second, my reflection wasn't mine. It was distorted, like I was looking at myself through a warped lens. My face was pale, my eyes wide with terror. I recoiled, stumbling backward, but when I blinked, my reflection was back to normal. I stood there, staring at the mirror, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But nothing made sense. From that point on, the misfortunes seemed to escalate. My phone broke. The screen shattered without warning, even though I hadn't dropped it. The coffee I spilled on my favorite shirt ruined it beyond repair. I missed appointments. My car broke down 3 times in 1 week. My friends started canceling plans on me, and I couldn't help but feel like the mirror was somehow involved. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that every accident, every misstep, had started the moment I brought it into my home. I started researching the mirror, looking for any information about its history. The more I dug, the more I discovered about its dark past. The mirror had been in the possession of a wealthy family for generations, passed down from one relative to another. But every member of the family who owned it had met a tragic end. There were stories of suicides, mysterious disappearances, and broken lives. It seemed like the mirror was tied to their downfall, its curse spreading through each generation. But the most chilling part? Every account mentioned the same thing. The reflection wasn't just a reflection. It was something else. Something alive. Something that wanted to take over. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to destroy the mirror. I couldn't live with the constant dread, the feeling that I was being watched, the string of misfortunes that had taken over my life. I grabbed the hammer from the toolbox, determined to end it. But as I lifted it above my head, something strange happened. The room grew colder. The reflection in the mirror began to distort, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. I froze, the hammer hanging in midair, as the figure in the mirror grinned at me. Except it wasn't my reflection anymore. The figure had hollow eyes, its face twisted into an eerie, mocking smile. Its hands pressed against the glass, as if trying to escape. My heart hammered in my chest as I took a step back, lowering the hammer. I couldn't destroy it. I couldn't. It was like the mirror was pulling me in, holding me captive with its malevolent force. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. My breath was visible in front of me, but it wasn't just cold air. The room seemed to be breathing. The walls pulsated, the floor creaked beneath me, and the reflection in the mirror, it moved on its own. I ran. I didn't even stop to think. I bolted out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest, and slammed the door behind me. I locked it, but I could still feel the mirror calling me, the whispers echoing in my mind. I heard its voice, faint but growing louder. Come back. But I didn't. I couldn't. The next morning, I woke up to find the mirror gone. I didn't remember taking it down, didn't remember moving it at all, but it wasn't in my bedroom anymore. I checked every room in the house, but it was nowhere to be found. It was as if the mirror had disappeared into thin air. But the damage had already been done. My life had become a series of endless misfortunes. It wasn't just the accidents anymore. I began to lose track of time, often waking up in different places, not remembering how I got there. I'd hear voices when no one was around, feel hands brush against me in the dark, and the worst part? The reflection. Every time I looked into a mirror, I saw that twisted, hollow-eyed figure watching me from the other side. I never knew when it would happen, but it was always there, lurking in the glass, waiting for the right moment. I tried to leave, tried to escape the house, but no matter where I went, I could feel the mirror's presence, like it was following me, pulling me deeper into its curse. There was no escaping it. Now, I'm writing this, hoping someone will listen. The mirror is out there. And if you ever come across an antique mirror, especially one with intricate carvings and a history that seems too perfect to be true, don't buy it. Don't touch it. Don't even look at it. Because once it has you, it won't let you go. The curse is real, and it will follow you until you lose yourself completely. And that's how I became a reflection, trapped in the glass. I never believed in curses. I never believed in anything supernatural, either. My life was rational, orderly, and, frankly, boring. But that was before the doll. It was the last thing I expected to change everything. It wasn't anything extraordinary to look at. In fact, it was a bit plain. A small, old-fashioned porcelain doll, about the size of a small child's hand, with a faded blue dress and a bonnet tied under her chin. Her glassy blue eyes stared up at me, empty and lifeless, her cheeks painted a pale pink. I found her at an estate sale. The house was full of antiques, vases, furniture, old photographs, and it was easy to get lost in the history of the place. But when I stumbled upon the doll, something strange stirred inside me. I couldn't explain it. I had to have it. I had no idea why, but I bought the doll on impulse, paying way more than I should have. The old woman running the sale seemed almost relieved to be rid of it, her hands shaking slightly as she handed it over to me. "Be careful with that one," she warned, her voice low and hurried. It's not just a doll. It's cursed. I don't think you should take it." I chuckled, thinking she was just an eccentric old woman trying to make her items seem more valuable. "I'll be fine," I said, taking the doll from her hands with a smile. "Thanks." I brought the doll home and placed it on my bookshelf. It was small enough to fit in the corner, nestled among a few old books and trinkets. At first, nothing unusual happened. I went about my days, enjoying my quiet apartment and the new addition to my collection. But then, strange things began to happen. It started with the whispers. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I'd hear soft voices in the middle of the night, distant but unmistakable. They weren't in my dreams. They were real as the sound of the wind outside. I would lie awake, listening, straining to understand what they were saying. But the words were always just out of reach. Then came the accidents. Little things, at first. A glass falling off the counter for no reason. A door slamming shut by itself. I chalked it up to bad luck. Nothing more. But after a while, the incidents became too frequent to ignore. One morning, I woke up to find my kitchen flooded, water spilling out of the sink, pooling across the floor. I had left the faucet running the night before, but it wasn't like me to forget something so simple. Then, the power went out without warning. No storm, no explanation, just total darkness. I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator, but it was the only sound in the house. I felt like something was wrong. Something was watching me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I was a rational person, and I refused to let my imagination take over. But the doll was always there, staring at me from the bookshelf. Its glass eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went. I began to feel like I was being haunted by its gaze. I couldn't explain why, but it made me uncomfortable. It wasn't just that it was an old doll. It was that it seemed to have something more. A presence, maybe, or an energy that wasn't quite right. The worst incident came on a quiet evening when I was sitting on the couch, watching TV. It had been a long day at work, and I was too tired to do anything but zone out in front of the screen. But then I felt it, a cold draft brushing across my neck. It was so sudden that I jumped, my skin prickling with unease. The air in the room grew heavier, as though something had changed. I glanced around the apartment, but nothing seemed out of place. Then, my eyes landed on the bookshelf. The doll, its porcelain face grinning at me, was no longer sitting where I had placed it. It was standing upright on the edge of the shelf, as if it had somehow climbed to its feet. My heart skipped a beat, my breath catching in my throat. I stood up, walking slowly toward the shelf, unsure of what I was about to see. As I got closer, I could hear it, soft whispers, almost too faint to hear, coming from the doll itself. The whispers grew louder the closer I got, until I could hear them clearly. "She's coming for you. She's going to take you away." I froze, staring at the doll in disbelief. I reached out to touch it, my hand trembling. The moment my fingers made contact with the cold porcelain, the whispers stopped. And just like that, the doll fell back into place, its small body sitting innocently on the shelf. I couldn't explain it. I tried to rationalize it away. Maybe the doll had somehow fallen over, and I had just missed it. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I decided to look into the doll's history, hoping to find some clue that would explain these strange occurrences. I spent hours online, researching antique dolls and haunted objects. It didn't take long before I came across something that made my stomach churn. The doll had once belonged to a little girl named Amelia, who had lived in the house where the estate sale had been held. Amelia had been a sweet child, but tragically, she had passed away in an accident when she was just 7 years old. The doll had been her constant companion, and after her death, it was said that the doll's spirit had never left. As the story went, Amelia's spirit was restless, unable to move on. She was angry that she had been taken so young. Her spirit had latched onto the doll, and the curse had followed it from owner to owner, causing misfortune and tragedy wherever it went. At first, I dismissed it as another ghost story, a tall tale meant to scare people. But as I read on, I found more reports of people who had owned the doll before me. All of them had experienced inexplicable events, loss, grief, strange accidents. Some had even gone mad, claiming that the doll had haunted them, tormenting them with its eerie whispers and its cold, unblinking stare. The more I learned, the more I realized that I was caught in something far worse than I could have imagined. I had invited this curse into my life, and there was no way to escape it now. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. The doll's presence weighed heavily on me, and the whispers grew louder each night. It wasn't just that I could hear them. It was as if they were calling to me, urging me to do something, to follow them. I started seeing shadows in the corners of my vision, figures that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Then, things began to escalate. I woke up one night to find the doll standing at the foot of my bed, its eyes gleaming in the dark. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just stared at it, waiting for something to happen, terrified of what might come next. I tried to get rid of the doll. I took it to a nearby lake and threw it in, hoping that it would be gone for good. But when I returned home that night, it was waiting for me, sitting on the couch as if nothing had happened. The whispers were getting louder now. I couldn't focus on anything. I couldn't go outside, couldn't leave my apartment. It was like the doll was controlling me, trapping me in this never-ending nightmare. I don't know how much longer I can last. The doll is still here, and I can feel it getting stronger. Its whispers are constant now, filling my mind, pushing me toward the edge of madness. I can't escape. I can't run. No matter what I do, it follows me. It's always there, in the corner of my eye, watching, waiting. I don't know how to break the curse, or if it's even possible. All I know is that I'm trapped, and there's no way out. If you ever come across a doll like this, small, old, with glassy blue eyes, don't take it. Don't even touch it, because once it has you, it won't let go. The doll is coming for me, and soon, it will come for you, too. Now, as I write this, I hear it, the soft whispers calling my name. I can feel the cold porcelain against my skin, and I know it's only a matter of time before the doll takes me. But if you're reading this, maybe you'll still have a chance to escape. Just don't make the same mistake I did. Whatever you do, don't let the doll in. I've always had a fascination with antiques. There's something about them, about owning a piece of history, something that's lived longer than you have, that makes them feel special. Most people find them odd, or even creepy, but to me, they're treasures, little glimpses into the past. That is, until I bought the music box. It happened one weekend when I was at a flea market. The sun was bright, and the air had that crisp feeling that comes with early autumn. It was a busy day, and the market was buzzing with people haggling over trinkets, clothes, and old knickknacks. I had my usual habit of browsing through booths filled with forgotten treasures when something caught my eye. A small, delicate music box sitting alone on a wooden table. It was made of polished mahogany with intricate carvings along its sides, flowers, birds, and swirls that seemed to come to life as I stared at them. The lid was adorned with a tiny porcelain ballerina, one arm raised in a frozen pirouette. It was beautiful, almost haunting in its stillness. There was something about it that immediately drew me in. Without thinking twice, I reached for it, inspecting it closer. The seller, a middle-aged man with a tired look in his eyes, watched me carefully. "That's an old one," he said quietly, almost like he was warning me. "Been in my family for generations. But I'm willing to part with it." "I'll take it," I said impulsively. My curiosity overpowered any sense of caution. I handed him the money and walked away, cradling the music box in my hands like it was something fragile, precious. The moment I walked out of the flea market, the weather seemed to change. The warm sunlight turned into an overcast sky, as if a storm was rolling in. When I got home, I placed the music box on my dresser. I admired the way the polished wood reflected the dim light of the room. For a moment, everything felt right. The room felt calm and peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had found something truly special. I opened the lid to hear the tune. It was a soft, gentle melody, slow, elegant. The ballerina inside twirled as the music played, her delicate figure spinning in the quiet room. I sat down on my bed, closing my eyes for a moment to take in the sound. But as the music played on, something in the air seemed to shift. The temperature in the room dropped, and a heavy feeling settled over me. I tried to ignore it, blaming the chill on the change in weather. But as the music continued to play, I felt an inexplicable sense of unease. It wasn't the melody itself. It was the way the air felt, thick and oppressive. And then, as the song reached its end, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The ballerina's movement had slowed down, as if it was struggling to continue. I reached out to close the lid, but when I touched it, I froze. The music box seemed to hum under my fingertips, vibrating slightly as if it was alive. The next day, strange things began to happen. It started small, little inconveniences. I spilled coffee on my favorite shirt. I tripped over the rug and sprained my ankle. But then, the events started to escalate. I dropped my phone, cracking the screen. A light bulb exploded in my kitchen for no reason. The next morning, I woke up with a headache that wouldn't go away. And then, the nightmares started. Every night, I would lie in bed, trying to sleep, but the sound of the music box would play in my head, louder and louder. The haunting melody echoed in my ears until I couldn't escape it, and in my dreams, the ballerina would be dancing, spinning faster and faster, until her delicate body twisted unnaturally. Her eyes, her empty, glassy eyes, would stare directly at me as if begging me to stop her. One night, I woke up to the sound of music playing softly in the room. I blinked, confused, and sat up, my heart racing. The music box was closed. I had made sure to close it before going to bed, but now, the song was playing again, faintly, as if it was coming from the other side of the room. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the sound, but I saw nothing out of place. I tried to ignore it, but the music grew louder and louder until it felt like it was all around me, drowning out everything else. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for the music box, determined to put an end to the madness. But when I opened the lid, the ballerina wasn't there. Instead, there was only darkness, a black void that seemed to stretch on forever. I slammed the lid shut, my heart pounding in my chest. The music stopped immediately. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to calm myself. Was I losing my mind? The next day, I decided to get rid of the music box. I didn't care what it cost or how beautiful it was. I just wanted it gone. I wrapped it up and made my way to the local pawn shop, but when I got there, something strange happened. The moment I entered the shop, I felt a chill run down my spine. The shopkeeper looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "You're here about the music box, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low. I froze. "How did you know?" It's the same with every person who buys it, he said, almost as if he was speaking from experience. You can't get rid of it once it's in your hands. You can try, but it'll find its way back to you. I shook my head. I don't believe you. I just want to get rid of it. But as I reached into my bag to pull it out, something stopped me. A faint whisper in the back of my mind. Don't let it go. It will come for you. It will never leave. I pulled my hand back, trembling. I changed my mind. The shopkeeper's eyes softened, and he looked at me with pity. You won't be able to outrun it. You have to keep it, or it will follow you. I turned and left the shop, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do anymore. It felt like the music box was controlling me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I knew it was cursed. I knew that it had a hold on me, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. The days turned into weeks, and the misfortunes only grew worse. I couldn't focus on anything. My work performance slipped. I lost my appetite. I couldn't sleep without hearing the music box in my head, without seeing the ballerina's empty eyes in the dark corners of my mind. But one night, the curse took a darker turn. I woke up to find the music box on my dresser, the lid open, and the ballerina spinning, moving on her own. I could hear the soft, melodic tune playing, but it was no longer gentle. It was distorted, almost as if it was mocking me. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating, and I could feel the presence of something dark and ancient, pressing in on me. And then I saw it. The reflection in the mirror across from the music box wasn't mine. It was a shadowy figure, hunched and twisted, with long, bony fingers reaching toward the ballerina. Its eyes glowed red, and its mouth opened in a wide, sinister grin. I screamed, running out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. But the music continued, growing louder with every step I took. That was when I knew. The curse wasn't just on the music box. It was on me. It had followed me, taken root in my life, and now there was no escaping it. I tried everything, burning the music box, throwing it into the river, even burying it deep in the woods. But no matter what I did, it always came back. The melody would start playing again, faintly at first, and then louder and louder until it filled my mind completely. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. The music box is still here, still playing its haunting tune in the back of my mind. And every time I try to get rid of it, it only grows stronger. If you ever come across a music box like the one I bought, one that's too beautiful, too perfect, don't take it. Leave it behind. Because once it's in your hands, it will never let you go. And it will make sure you never forget the haunting tune. I've never believed in ghosts or curses. I was always the practical one, the skeptic who rolled my eyes at anyone who spoke of haunted houses or cursed artifacts. I thought it was all just superstition, until that mirror found its way into my life. It all started at an antique shop. I was in the city for a weekend trip, and while I was walking around, I stumbled upon a quaint little store tucked away between two larger buildings. The sign outside read Curiosities and Oddities, which piqued my interest. Inside, the store was dimly lit, filled with old furniture, strange trinkets, and various artifacts from another time. It was the kind of place you could spend hours in, marveling at the oddities, and I was eager to explore. There were countless items that caught my attention, but it was the mirror that I couldn't stop staring at. It was large, standing at least 6 feet tall, with a beautiful ornate frame made of dark wood, covered in intricate carvings of vines and faces that seemed to watch me as I approached. The mirror itself was slightly cloudy, and despite its age, it had a certain elegance that drew me in. The shopkeeper, an older woman with a stern face, watched me closely. "That's an old one," she said, her voice low and unsettling. "Been in my family for generations. I'd be careful if I were you." I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the woman's eccentricity. "I'll take it," I said, the words coming out before I even really thought about it. The mirror felt special, almost like it had a history, and I couldn't resist the urge to own it. She gave me a strange look, almost as if she was warning me, but she wrapped the mirror carefully in cloth and handed it to me. "Remember," she said softly, "some things are better left alone." I thought she was just trying to make a sale, so I smiled politely and left the store. unaware that I had just taken something much darker than I could have ever imagined. When I got back to my apartment, I unwrapped the mirror and set it against the wall in the living room. The moment I stood it up, I felt a chill in the air, but I shrugged it off as the draft from the old windows. The mirror didn't seem special at first, just a beautiful, antique piece. I admired the way the frame reflected the soft light from my lamp, and for a while, I forgot about the warnings the shopkeeper had given me. That night, I went to bed as usual, but something kept me awake. A feeling of unease. I kept thinking I saw something in the reflection, something just out of view. It was almost as if the mirror was pulling me in, like it was alive, beckoning me to look deeper. But I resisted the urge, turning my back to it and eventually falling into an uneasy sleep. The first strange event occurred the following evening. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I suddenly felt an intense, cold gust of air. It was as if someone had opened a window, but I had checked earlier, and all the windows were closed. I looked up and saw the mirror reflecting nothing but darkness, but something felt off. I stood up and walked over to it, noticing that the reflection of the room seemed slightly different. The shadows in the mirror were darker than they should have been, and the room appeared colder, even though the temperature hadn't changed. I tried to brush it off as a trick of the light, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. That night, the mirror seemed to call to me in my dreams. I dreamt of standing in front of it, staring into the glass. I couldn't see my own reflection, only the reflection of a figure standing behind me. But when I turned around, no one was there. In the dream, I reached out to touch the mirror, and the moment my fingers made contact, a cold hand grabbed my wrist, pulling me toward the glass. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, and I immediately looked toward the mirror. It was still there, reflecting nothing but my empty living room. Over the next few days, things started to spiral. The mirror's influence seemed to grow stronger. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drawn to it, unable to look away. Every time I walked past it, I couldn't resist glancing at my reflection, even though I knew something wasn't right. The figure in the mirror seemed to move, shifting just beyond my line of sight. Sometimes, I could almost see a shadow behind me, lurking just out of view. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted. I glanced up at the mirror, and this time, I noticed something strange. The reflection was showing the room as it looked several minutes ago, with the lights dimmer and shadows deeper. It was like the mirror was showing a version of my apartment from a few minutes earlier, like it had captured a moment in time and was stuck there. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked closer. The room in the reflection appeared darker still, but this time, I noticed something more chilling. In the reflection, there was a figure standing near the door. A tall, thin shadow that didn't belong. It had no face, only a black void where its head should have been. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. When I turned to look around the room, the figure wasn't there. It was only in the mirror. The next few days were a blur of terror. I began to lose track of time, waking up in the middle of the night, my mind foggy and confused. I'd stare at the mirror for hours, unable to look away, watching the figure slowly inch closer and closer toward me. Sometimes, I would catch glimpses of its long, skeletal fingers moving along the frame, as if it were trying to escape. I tried to get rid of it, throwing a blanket over the mirror, but the moment I covered it, the temperature in the room dropped, and the shadows grew darker. I could still feel the presence of the figure behind the glass, as if it were pressing against it, trying to break free. I didn't know how to make it stop, and no matter what I did, the mirror wouldn't let go. The most terrifying part, however, was that the figure in the mirror started to change. It began to mimic my movements. If I stood still, it stood still. If I moved, it moved. It was as if it was waiting for me to make a mistake, to do something that would allow it to slip through the glass and into the real world. That's when the accidents started. At first, they were small. I stubbed my toe on the coffee table. I spilled coffee on my favorite shirt. But then they escalated. My kitchen light started flickering uncontrollably, and one evening, the entire bulb exploded, sending shards of glass across the room. I cut my hand trying to clean it up, and as I wiped the blood away, I could swear I saw a shadow moving just outside my window. But nothing was worse than what happened one night when I dared to sleep with the mirror uncovered. I woke up to the sound of soft scratching against the glass. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. But when I looked at the mirror, I saw it, the figure. It was closer than it had ever been before. Its dark, faceless form was pressed up against the glass, its long, thin fingers scraping against the surface. Its body was bent at an unnatural angle, like it was trying to get to me. The scratching grew louder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was as if the mirror was alive, as if the figure wanted to pull me inside. In the days that followed, I tried everything to break the curse. I contacted a psychic, hoping for an answer, but she only gave me a cryptic warning. The mirror will never let you go. I tried to smash the glass with a hammer, but the moment the hammer touched the surface, it bounced off as if the mirror were made of steel. I even tried to burn it, but the flames just flickered and died out, leaving the mirror untouched. It was clear now. The mirror wasn't just cursed, it was alive. I don't know how long I can keep this up. Every time I look into the glass, the figure gets closer, pressing against the surface as if it's trying to break free. I can hear its whispers now, faint but clear, calling my name. If you ever come across an old mirror, especially one with intricate carvings like mine, do yourself a favor, walk away. Don't even look at it, because once you bring it home, it will never let you go. The reflection will pull you in, and you'll be trapped forever, just like me. And I know, deep down, that the figure is only a few steps away from breaking through. I can feel it. Soon, it will have me. And it will have you too, if you're not careful. The mirror always gets what it wants. It was an impulse buy. I didn't believe in curses or superstitions. I thought those kinds of things were for people who were easily scared by shadows and things that go bump in the night. But looking back, I wish I had listened when the old woman warned me about the ring. I was on a trip with some friends to a small town in the mountains. It was a quaint place, full of old shops and antique stores, the kind of place where you could spend hours wandering around, browsing forgotten relics from a bygone era. My friends and I spent most of the afternoon exploring the town, and that's when we stumbled upon a tiny shop that none of us had noticed before. It was tucked between two larger stores, almost as if it didn't want to be found. The sign outside simply read, "Curiosities." Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The shop smelled old, dusty, with a faint scent of something metallic in the air. The shelves were cluttered with all sorts of strange objects: tarnished silver spoons, tarnished jewelry, old paintings, and glass jars filled with unidentifiable things. It was dark inside, with only a few dim lights hanging from the ceiling, but there was something strangely inviting about the place. I was about to leave when something caught my eye, a small display case sitting near the back of the store. Inside was a ring. It wasn't particularly ornate, but there was something about it that drew me in. The band was made of dark, weathered silver, with a small, rough-cut stone set in the center. It wasn't the most beautiful ring I'd ever seen, but something about it felt powerful. The old woman behind the counter noticed me staring at it and approached. Her eyes were dark and deep, like she had seen too much in her life. "Ah, you found it," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "That's the ring of misfortune." I laughed nervously. "The ring of what?" She sighed and gave me a long, knowing look. "It's cursed. Whoever wears it will be doomed to misfortune." I rolled my eyes, ready to dismiss her as just another eccentric shopkeeper, but her eyes never left mine. There was something in her gaze, something that made my stomach tighten. "I don't believe in that kind of thing," I said with a small laugh. "But thanks anyway." The woman didn't smile. "It's your choice, of course," she said, her voice still calm. "But remember, once you put it on, you can't take it off, and it will find a way to make you regret it." She didn't say anything else, and I decided to leave, but as I walked out of the store, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have listened to her. The thought of the ring lingered in my mind, and when I returned to my room that evening, I found myself thinking about it again. It wasn't the most expensive thing, so I figured I might as well go back the next day and buy it. And that's exactly what I did. The moment I slid the ring onto my finger, something strange happened. It felt cold, almost like it had been pulled straight from a freezer, but I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the metal, or perhaps my imagination. I didn't know it then, but that was the first sign. The first hint that something was terribly wrong. The next day, things started to go awry. It began small, nothing too alarming. I spilled coffee on my favorite shirt. My phone fell into the sink while I was washing dishes, ruining it completely. I stubbed my toe on a chair and swore under my breath. I thought it was just bad luck, but as the day wore on, the accidents kept happening. I dropped my wallet, and all my money spilled out onto the street. When I tried to get into my car, the door wouldn't open, and I had to call for a tow. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, I received a phone call telling me that a family member had been hospitalized. My mind was spinning. The ring. It had to be the ring. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the ring glowing faintly, even through my closed eyelids. I tried to take it off, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like it had fused with my skin, as if it had become a part of me. I went back to the antique store, hoping the old woman could help, but when I arrived, the shop was closed, and there was no sign of the woman. I stood in front of the door, feeling helpless and desperate. My mind was racing. What was happening to me? Why couldn't I remove the ring? The next few days were a blur of misfortune. It was as if the ring was feeding on my every mistake, twisting them into disasters. I lost my job when the printer jammed on an important report. My car broke down in the middle of nowhere. I missed my train, and the restaurant I had planned to eat at went out of business. Every time something bad happened, I could feel the ring tightening on my finger, as if it were drawing strength from my misery. It wasn't just the small things either. I started to feel a presence around me, like something was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At night, I would hear whispers, faint and distant, calling my name from the darkness. I'd look around, but there was never anyone there. My friends began to notice, too. I was always on edge, constantly checking my surroundings, like something terrible was about to happen. One night, I woke up to find my reflection in the mirror staring back at me, but it wasn't my face. It was distorted, twisted, with dark shadows creeping around the edges of the glass. My reflection smiled, but I hadn't moved my mouth. My heart raced as I backed away, but the reflection didn't stop smiling. It was mocking me, taunting me. I ran out of the room, but the whispers followed me. "You shouldn't have taken it," they said, their voices echoing in my mind. At this point, I was desperate. I knew the ring was cursed, but I couldn't break free from it. The old woman's warning echoed in my mind. Once you put it on, you can't take it off. I didn't believe her at first, but now I was living it. I couldn't escape. The worst part came when I realized the ring was affecting not just me, but the people around me. My friend Sarah, who had been by my side through everything, started having bad luck of her own. She got into a car accident, though she was unhurt. Her house flooded. Her dog went missing. It was like the ring had spread its curse to everyone I cared about. I had to stop it, but how? I tried everything. I went to a priest for help, but he just shook his head. "It's too late," he said. "Once a curse takes hold, it's hard to get rid of." One night, in a fit of desperation, I tried to throw the ring into a river, but as soon as it hit the water, it was back on my finger. It was as if the ring had a will of its own, and no matter how hard I tried to escape, it would always find me. Now, as I write this, I feel the weight of the ring on my finger. The whispers are growing louder, and I can feel the coldness creeping into my bones. The misfortunes continue to spiral out of control. My life is falling apart, and I can't seem to stop it. If you ever come across a ring like mine, dark, simple, yet somehow captivating, don't make the same mistake I did. Don't give in to curiosity. Leave it behind and walk away. Because once it's on your finger, it's too late. The curse will follow you, and there's no escaping it. And if you hear a faint whisper, calling your name from the shadows, it's already too late. The ring has found you. I never believed in curses. My life had always been practical, grounded in reason. But the moment I encountered the pocket watch, everything changed. What started as a simple curiosity turned into a nightmare that I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. It all began on a rainy afternoon, during one of my many trips to estate sales and antique shops. I've always enjoyed collecting old, odd pieces, vintage watches, trinkets, and occasionally furniture with a bit of character. That day, I was perusing a small shop in the back of a quiet street, tucked behind rows of houses, the kind of place most people would pass without a second glance. As I stepped inside, the smell of aged wood and dust filled the air, and the dim light made everything feel a little more mysterious. I walked past several shelves of old porcelain dolls, tarnished silverware, and faded books when something caught my eye. A small pocket watch sitting alone on a display case. The watch itself wasn't particularly ornate. Its brass casing was worn with age, and the chain looked delicate, almost fragile. The face of the watch was cracked, and the hands were frozen at precisely 11:59. Yet, there was something about it that felt different. There was an energy around it, an almost magnetic pull that drew me closer. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a cane, noticed my interest. "Ah, I see you found it," he said with a slow smile. His voice was raspy, and his eyes held a glint of something I couldn't place. "That's an old one. It's been in my family for years." I picked it up, the cold metal sending a shiver up my spine, but I dismissed it as nothing more than a reaction to the temperature of the room. The watch felt oddly heavy in my hand, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the hands twitch, just a fraction of movement, but when I looked closer, it was still frozen. "It's a curious thing," the man continued, "but not something I would recommend keeping." I smiled, more out of politeness than interest. "Why is that?" He hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "It's cursed. It brings misfortune. People who wear it, bad things tend to happen. I've seen it with my own eyes. Take it if you like, but I'd advise against it." I laughed it off. "Come on, it's just a watch. I collect these kinds of things all the time." "Thank you for the warning, though." The old man didn't smile. "I warned you," he said, his voice soft but firm. "There are some things better left alone." The words lingered in my mind as I paid for the watch, but as I walked out of the store and back into the rain, I brushed it off. Superstition, I told myself. It was an old man's story, nothing more. I tucked the watch into my pocket and headed home. The first few days after I bought the watch seemed normal. I kept it on my desk, admiring its craftsmanship. I even tried to wind it up, but the hands wouldn't budge. It was as if the watch was frozen in time, an artifact of a forgotten past. But then, the misfortunes started. At first, they were small, trivial even. I spilled coffee on my favorite shirt, broke a mug I had owned for years, and missed the bus. Annoying, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. I chalked it up to bad luck, especially since I had just bought an antique watch. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But then, the accidents grew more frequent. One morning, I woke up late and rushed to get ready for work. As I was leaving my apartment, I slipped on the stairs and twisted my ankle. It wasn't just a small twist either. I ended up in the emergency room with a sprained ligament. I couldn't even walk without crutches for the next week. The day after the accident, I was sitting at home, feeling sorry for myself when I noticed something odd. The watch, which I had left on my desk, was now on the floor by the door. I hadn't moved it, and I certainly hadn't seen it fall. I bent down to pick it up, and the moment my fingers touched the cold metal, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like something had pricked me. I let out a gasp and dropped the watch, but when I looked at my hand, there was no mark, no injury, just a cold, heavy sensation in the air. I shook my head, dismissing it as nothing. Maybe I was just overtired from the injury. Maybe it was a trick of my mind. But then things started to get worse. My car broke down on the way to work the next day. I wasn't stranded in the middle of nowhere, but the engine failure was so severe that I had to have the car towed to a shop. The repair bill was more than I could afford at the time. The watch, which I had absent-mindedly placed in the cup holder, seemed to call out to me again, almost as if it were mocking me. That night, while I was at home, I noticed something even stranger. I heard a faint ticking sound coming from the direction of my desk. I walked over, thinking that maybe I had left a clock running, but the room was silent. Yet, the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent. It was the watch, ticking in time with my heartbeat, as if it had come to life. I picked it up again, trying to wind it, But this time, the hands of the watch moved. Slowly at first, then quicker and quicker, until they reached 12 o'clock. The clock stopped ticking. A terrible silence filled the room, and I felt my stomach churn. That was the moment I realized something was horribly wrong. In the days that followed, the string of misfortunes only intensified. I missed a job interview due to an unexpected flat tire. I received an anonymous letter with cruel threats. And one night, after walking home from a late dinner, I was attacked by a stranger who tried to rob me. I managed to escape unharmed, but the incident left me shaken to the core. I couldn't help but feel like it was all connected to the cursed watch. I started researching its history, hoping to find some kind of explanation. That's when I found it, an article about a man named Charles Devereux, a watchmaker from the 1800s. According to the records, Devereux had crafted a series of pocket watches, each more intricate than the last. However, after his wife died under mysterious circumstances, his business went into decline. Legend had it that he infused the last series of watches with dark magic, hoping to reverse time and bring her back. The story didn't stop there. It was said that anyone who owned one of these watches would experience increasing misfortune until they too died under mysterious circumstances. The watches had become infamous for being cursed, and the last known one had disappeared decades ago. It became clear. The watch was the same one. Devereux's cursed creation had found its way to me. I tried to get rid of it. I threw it in the trash, but it reappeared on my desk the next day. I burned it, but the flames didn't touch it, and the watch remained whole and scathed. I buried it deep in the woods, but somehow, it always found its way back to me. The curse seemed inescapable. My life began to crumble. I lost my job, my apartment, and most of my friends who couldn't stand my paranoia and bad luck. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus. Everywhere I went, misfortune followed. The watch never left my side, as if it were a constant reminder of my impending doom. Then, one night, as I sat in my empty apartment, staring at the watch in my trembling hands, something changed. The air grew thick with an unnatural stillness, and I could hear the watch ticking louder and louder, as if it were counting down to something. The hands slowly moved, passing through 11:59, and then the watch stopped, and then everything stopped. I don't know what happened next. The memories are blurry, but when I woke up, I was sitting in my darkened apartment, the watch still in my hand, and the room was as still as death itself. The world outside seemed to be moving in slow motion, but I was stuck, frozen. I don't know how long I've been here. The ticking is gone now, and I haven't aged a single day. The watch is still with me, but it no longer brings misfortune. It brings silence. If you ever come across an old pocket watch, especially one that seems too perfect, too heavy, or too silent, leave it behind. Don't take it. Don't touch it. Because once it finds you, it will never let you go. And when the ticking stops, you will too. It was an old, dusty toy that first caught my attention. My friends and I were on a weekend trip to the countryside, staying in an old bed and breakfast. The place was charming but ancient, with creaky floorboards and peeling wallpaper. It felt like stepping back in time, with relics from another era scattered around the house. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Abernathy, had a strange, unsettling aura. She was kind, but there was something in her eyes that felt like she was always hiding something. One evening, after a long day of hiking, I wandered into the parlor while the others were relaxing. The room was filled with antiques, a grand piano, faded paintings, and large, heavy furniture. But in the corner of the room, resting atop a shelf, was a doll. It was a porcelain figure, dressed in a frilly, old-fashioned gown. Its eyes were dark, almost lifelike, and it had a permanent, unnerving smile on its face. There was something about it that felt off, like it didn't belong in the room. It looked out of place, and its eerie expression seemed to follow me as I moved. I wasn't the only one who noticed it. When I went to grab a glass of water, my friend Jenna looked at the doll from across the room. "That thing is creepy," she said, shuddering. "It looks like it's staring at me." I didn't think much of it at first, but the more I looked at the doll, the more unsettled I became. It wasn't like the usual antique dolls you find in stores. This one had an unnatural stillness to it, as if it were waiting for something. the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. Later that night, I was lying in bed, trying to sleep. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the doll's face in my mind, its painted smile never faltering. My heart raced as the feeling of unease settled over me. I eventually drifted off, but not without a sense of foreboding. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The sun was shining, and we all gathered in the dining room for breakfast. Mrs. Abernathy served us fresh eggs and toast, and we chatted about our plans for the day. But when we finished eating and were about to leave, I noticed something strange. The doll was no longer on the shelf. At first, I thought I had just imagined it being there in the first place, but when I asked Jenna, she confirmed it had been there the night before. "It's gone," she said, wide-eyed. "I swear, it was right there." We searched the parlor, but there was no sign of it. Mrs. Abernathy acted as if nothing was unusual. "It must have fallen," she said with a dismissive wave. "I'll put it back when I get a chance." That should have been the end of it, but something felt off. We all felt it, that unsettling chill in the air. The doll was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching us. Wherever we went, I tried to put it out of my mind, but it lingered like a shadow. Later that afternoon, while we were out on a walk through the nearby woods, we began to experience an unsettling string of bad luck. First, Jenna tripped on a root and sprained her ankle. Then, Matt dropped his phone in the creek, ruining it. Even I wasn't immune. My camera, which I just bought a few weeks ago, malfunctioned and wouldn't turn on. We laughed it off, attributing it to coincidence. But as the day went on, the accidents kept happening. The more we tried to laugh and brush it off, the more the sense of dread grew. We returned to the bed and breakfast in the late afternoon, exhausted and frustrated. Mrs. Abernathy greeted us with a smile, though there was something strange in her eyes. It was as though she knew something we didn't. "You all look worn out," she said, her voice sweet but unnerving. "Perhaps you should rest. You wouldn't want to overexert yourselves. I wouldn't want anyone getting hurt." I chalked it up to her being an overly attentive host, but the others seemed a little more on edge than usual. We all went our separate ways to our rooms, but that night, things took a turn for the worse. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the noise persisted, scratching, like something small was dragging across the floor. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened closely. The sound was coming from the hallway. I stepped out of bed and cautiously walked down the hallway to the source of the noise. To my horror, I found the doll sitting in the middle of the floor, its porcelain face grinning up at me. It had moved. It was impossible. I had seen it on the shelf earlier, and now it was on the floor, in the hallway, as though it had crawled out of the room on its own. I froze, my blood running cold. How could it have gotten here? I bent down to pick it up, and as my fingers brushed the smooth porcelain, a sudden chill ran through my body. The air around me felt heavy, suffocating. I felt a pressure in my chest, as though something was pushing down on me. I barely managed to stand up and retreat to my room. My heart was racing, and I slammed the door shut behind me, my mind reeling with what I had just witnessed. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but the weight in the air, the way the doll's eyes seemed to follow me even from the other side of the room, it felt too real. The next morning, the misfortunes escalated. Matt was the first to go missing. We assumed he had simply gone out for a walk, but when we searched the surrounding area, there was no sign of him. His room was empty, his things left behind, but the window was wide open, as if he had just vanished into thin air. We searched the town and the woods, but Matt was nowhere to be found. The local police were called in, but even they couldn't figure out what happened. That night, the doll appeared in my room again. This time, it was sitting on my bed, its eyes staring at me with a malevolent glint. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed it by the arm and ran down to the parlor, where I threw it in the fireplace, desperate to be rid of it once and for all. But the moment I threw it into the flames, something strange happened. The fire flared brightly, but the doll didn't burn. It stayed whole, untouched by the flames. Then, a chilling voice echoed through the room, as if coming from the doll itself. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered. "The curse is yours." The doll remained unscathed, its eyes still fixed on me as if mocking my efforts. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I backed away from the fire, my heart pounding, and in that moment, I knew that the curse was real. We left the bed and breakfast the next morning, though we couldn't shake the feeling that we had left something behind. The doll's curse hadn't just taken Matt. It was beginning to take us all. In the days that followed, more strange things happened. Jenna's sprained ankle turned into an infection that landed her in the hospital. Another friend, Claire, was involved in a car accident that left her with serious injuries. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. No matter where I went, I felt its presence, the doll, still out there, waiting for the right moment to claim me. The authorities eventually gave up on searching for Matt, but his disappearance remained unsolved. It was as if the bed and breakfast itself was cursed, and anyone who stayed there was doomed to fall victim to its dark history. I thought about returning to confront Mrs. Abernathy, to ask her why she had kept such a terrible object in her house, but when I went back to the town, I found that the bed and breakfast had been abandoned. The house had fallen into disrepair, and there was no sign of Mrs. Abernathy. The only thing left behind was the doll, a doll that I would never forget, no matter how far I ran. It was a reminder that some objects hold more than just history. They hold curses, dark and malevolent, waiting to claim anyone foolish enough to come near. If you ever come across an old doll, especially one with eyes that seem to follow you, stay away. Do not touch it. Do not take it home. For once it chooses you, it will never let you go.